Greetings and welcome to this week's Hagley History Hangout. Today, I am interviewing Al Churella, professor of history in the History and Philosophy Department at Kennesaw State University in Georgia, and author of a trilogy on the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad about the recently released Volume 3 of said trilogy, uh, The Long Decline, 1933 to 1968. I should know that. I'm Ben Spohn of the Hagley Museum and Library, and Al, thank you for joining me today. This is a long time coming.
Well, thank you, Ben. And yes, it is. I mean, I don't mean the interview. I mean wrapping up the three volumes, which is a project I started about 21, almost 22 years ago. So it's been a labor of love, but it's taken up a good chunk of my professional life. And I'm glad that the third volume is out. I'm glad to talk to you here today.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about how this came to be such an epic history for, I think, but I'm biased, of course, being a Hagley employee, an epic railroad?
Well, I'm biased too, but I would agree with the epic part. I mean, the Pennsylvania Railroad was at one time in the late 19th century the largest business corporation in the world. It was arguably the most influential railroad in the United States, if not in the world. It participated in the largest merger in American history up to that time, which was in 1968. And the company that came out of that, Penn Central, was unfortunately plunged into what was at that time the biggest bankruptcy in American business history. So it's a company of superlatives, most of them good, some of them bad. And given that, it uh, is a really vast project because my intent was not to talk about labor on the Pennsylvania Railroad or management on the Pennsylvania Railroad or women or African Americans on the Pennsylvania Railroad or technology on the Pennsylvania Railroad, though all of those elements are there, but it was to give a complete history of the railroad. So I was in fact asked to do this originally by the University of Pennsylvania Press back in 2003, and they envisioned a much shorter one-volume history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And rather foolishly and naively, I thought that that was something that could be done fairly quickly. I took on the project, and it just kind of grew. The more I found, the more information I saw, the more I read, the more I researched, the more archives like those at the Hagley that I visited, the more I began to appreciate just how complex the Pennsylvania Railroad's history was and how interconnected it was with everything, really, particularly with the government at all levels, local, state, federal, with public policy. And so to tell that story, I wound up not with one fairly short volume, but with three very long ones.
And how did you approach? I know we spoke about this before in our interview for volume two, but how did you approach the actual organization and setup of this book? Because it's not strictly speaking a narrative either. And I think that's worth talking about a little bit for anybody who might be joining the conversation for volume three.
I think that anybody who researches and writes history, or reads it for that matter, has to choose between one of two organizational frameworks. The most obvious one is chronological. I mean, we're historians after all. We look at change over time. So what happened 10 years ago, then what happened 5 years ago, then what happened 2 years ago. That seems like a logical progression, particularly because it reflects the cause and effect relationships that are so much a part of the evolution of historical ideas. But there's also a topical approach where we talk about different fields within history. And in fact, even though I say I'm a historian, I'm actually a historian of business. I'm a historian of technology, and I don't really spend much time talking professionally with my colleagues who do, say, ancient Greece and Rome or the Middle Ages in France, because they have a very different approach to things. Now, looking at a subject like the Pennsylvania Railroad, I immediately understood the value of a chronological narrative, but I also understood that there are so many different elements to the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. business, labor, government regulatory policy, race, gender, ethnicity, technology. I mean, and all of these things. And it was really going to be difficult to simply say, in 1903 this happened, then in 1904 that happened, then in 1905 that happened, particularly since in a company as large as the Pennsylvania Railroad, which at one time had basically 250,000 employees, there are people who are involved in one aspect of the company's operations who knew little or nothing about other aspects of the company's operations. So they're not necessarily going to see the big picture. They're going to see the particular topic or subject or area of focus. And so I tended to organize the book into a number of chapters, with one exception. They're all one-word chapters, like war or conflict or labor or something like that, that kind of give a hint as to how each chapter approaches a particular topic. And there is going to be some overlap here, of course. But I also thought, in a book of this length, well, three books, 1.6 million words, how many people are going to read every single word in every single page? Maybe people are going to want to simply take a deep dive into labor history or regulatory policy or some aspect of technology like signals or containerization or dieselization. And so they're not going to necessarily be as interested in some of the other aspects of the book. So I tried to kind of blend that chronological approach with a more topical one.
And then also with your title and your demarcation, how did you arrive at calling this the long decline and the 35-year period of 33 to 68?
The title was easy because I didn't actually think of it. It was suggested to me by one of my editors at Indiana University Press, which published volume two and volume three of the series. And as soon as that individual said that to me, I thought, "Oh, well, yeah, that works." I mean, they said, "Might this work?" And I said, "Absolutely, it's perfect." And I've been playing around, of course, with different iterations of the subtitle. As far as the 1933 to 1968 part is concerned, the first volume took the story to 1917. Which I think was appropriate because it's about the time when the Pennsylvania Railroad completes the massive New York improvements, including Penn Station and the Hellgate Bridge. Of course, it's when the United States enters World War I. There are profound changes. At that time, because that volume was published over a decade ago, I thought there would be a second volume from 1917, 1918 up to 1968. And the more I looked at the World War I years and the interwar period, that is the period between World War I and World War II, the more I saw that was going on in terms of labor policy, intermodal operations, business government relations, it really got complicated. And so I spent a lot of time talking about that. That became volume two from 1917 to 1933. And 1933, I think, is a good break point here too, because it's about the nadir of the Great Depression when things were looking bad for the entire economy, not to mention, of course, the railroad industry. When individuals like W. Atterbury are still in office, but beginning to kind of back away from their influence. And really, it's around 1933 that the railroads, and certainly the Pennsylvania Railroad, do begin this long decline. I mean, there's the Great Depression, of course. World War II revitalizes the Pennsylvania Railroad, but at a considerable cost. There's a huge growth in traffic, but with it, a lot of expenses in terms of railroad operation, a lot of wear and tear on the physical plant. And really, the Pennsylvania Railroad never fully recovers from that, particularly since the post-war period after 1945 sees massive government investments in the highway infrastructure, interstate highway network, in aviation, and so forth, which really kind of sends the PRR into this death spiral where the quality of service declines, traffic declines, revenue declines, and the company simply is not performing well enough to pull out of that and to rebuild its operations.
So it is a long multifactorial decline.
Yeah, and people do ask me, what killed the Pennsylvania Railroad? What caused the decline? And I say, how long do you have? Because there are many, many elements to this. Highway competition, even more so than aviation competition, shifting industrial base, the Rust Belt, high labor costs, the influence of unions, uh, poor management, an unsound regulatory policy, shifting travel preferences. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so, like any disaster, uh, there are multiple causes. And there certainly were in the disaster that was the decline and the merger in 1968, because I think that was a disaster. It was portrayed at the time as a panacea, something that would save the PRR and the New York Central, and more broadly, sort of set the pattern for saving the entire railroad industry in the Northeast. Even though at the time, some of the more prescient individuals in business and especially in government were looking at this and saying, this is not going to work out as well as people are saying. And they were right about that.
Yes, I was just thinking about at the time, I suppose he was a would-be governor of Pennsylvania with Milton Shaft's criticism of the merger.
Yes, and Milton Shapp was, in some respects, and I don't mean to really disparage him, but he was something of a blowhard. He was something of a political opportunist. Well, I mean, that's kind of what you'd expect from a politician, right? To manipulate the issues of the day into votes and positions of political power. He went to really extreme lengths to belittle and discredit the Pennsylvania Railroad and its management. And partly that was understandable, right? Because he's trying to protect the transportation and industrial base of Pennsylvania, to protect workers in Pennsylvania. But I think he was just too strident in his criticism. He was widely dismissed, derided, not only by newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is to be expected because Walter Annenberg, the owner and publisher of the Inquirer, was, on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Railroad and later the Penn Central. So he had good reason to malign Milton Shapp. But the courts tended to dismiss him. The ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, tended to dismiss him. And in many respects, he was right, but for all the wrong reasons. But there are plenty of other people who were more level-headed and more factually based in their criticism of the whole merger process and in their doubts about how well that merger would work out.
Right. And I think that's getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves for something that should come toward the end of the conversation. So let's start at the beginning with your first chapter um, on steam.
Well, and the title, I hope, kind of speaks for itself because, I mean, steam power was the engine, quite literally, of the British and then the American Industrial Revolutions. And certainly for 100 plus years, it was the sort of power source for the vast majority of American railroad locomotives, including those designed and built by the Pennsylvania Railroad at the Altoona Works. And as many of your listeners know, for about 80 years, the Pennsylvania Railroad designed and built its own locomotives. I mean, it bought others too from companies like Baldwin, but it was in the forefront of the development of steam locomotive technology. And particularly in the very late 1800s and into the early years of the 20th century, there was a small group of very well qualified uh, individuals. We call it like a community of technological practitioners who were just experts at developing steam locomotives. People like Theodore Ely, who was a proponent of what's called the small engine philosophy. He said, every additional pair of drivers, that is the main wheels that actually transmit the power the steam locomotive into forward momentum, that every pair of drivers adds unnecessary complications of friction and all that. In other words, it's the KISS principle, right? To keep it simple. And for many, many decades, Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive designers followed that logic. And it was only when individuals like Theodore Ely, Axel Vogt, and so on, William Kiesel, they sort of departed from the scene that the Pennsylvania Railroad kind of went down some rather counterproductive avenues in terms of locomotive design. But for many, many years, they were world beaters in terms of not only the quality, the power, the efficiency of their steam locomotives, but also the appearance of them. I think people like, Axel Vogt and Theodore Ely and so on, they really did appreciate the aesthetics of a steam locomotive, and they tried to develop designs that were practical, but also, in some sense, I think, beautiful.
And that is even outside the scope of the Pennsylvania Railroad's subsequent work with a figure like Raymond Loewy doing his streamlining.
Well, as I said in the book, Raymond Loewy never met an idea he wasn't willing to take credit for. And he was, I mean, I'm not, again, not disparaging him. He was a talented industrial designer. I don't think to the same extent as Dreyfus, who did a lot of work for the New York Central, and who, by the way, had ideas that Loewy, blatantly plagiarized. But I mean, a lot of the classic story is that Raymond Loewy designed the GG1. He didn't. That was actually the product of other industrial designers. The most that he really did with that locomotive was to say, well, let's get rid of the rivets and go with all welded kind of exterior construction and the pinstripes, which, I'll grant you are a nice touch. But Loewy, um, yeah, he certainly played a role, not so much in designing elements of, I mean, he had hundreds, if not thousands, of projects going for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was on retainer, but it wasn't so much that the things that he designed for the Pennsylvania Railroad, but the public relations value of saying that Raymond Loewy is the Pennsylvania Railroad's designer, stylist, and that is something that I think we need to keep in mind, that we often think of railroad executives, particularly those in the Pennsylvania Railroad, as being very conservative, very hidebound by tradition, very kind of practical minded, just make sure the trains run. But they were sensitive to public relations during the early years of the 20th century. And that is another way in which the Pennsylvania Railroad really was at the forefront of so many aspects of business history and set the kind of pattern for many other companies, not just in the railroad industry, but in business in general.
So what drives that, do you think? Is it the negative reputation railroads had at the time and feeling a need to combat that, or
Well, part of it is the negative reputation. Many people are familiar with Ivy Ledbetter Lee, who's often called the father of modern public relations. Again, as with Lowy, it's kind of a misnomer. He um, borrowed ideas from many other people, including his own business partners. But Ivy Lee was very important to the Pennsylvania Railroad because he did help to kind of counter this negative publicity. And understand this is the progressive era in the early years of the 20th century. And big business in general has a bad reputation. If you look at individuals like Ida Tarbell, whose father was a small scale refiner in northwestern Pennsylvania, who was ruined by Standard Oil, uh, in part in collaboration with an earlier generation of Pennsylvania Railroad executives. She writes this kind of muckraking expose on Standard Oil. Um, you have people like Frank Norris writing The Octopus, which is a thinly veiled attack on the Southern Pacific. But I mean, in general, large corporations are kind of on the defensive. And, certainly Rockefeller relies on Ivy Lee to kind of rebuild his reputation, and the Pennsylvania Railroad does as well. particularly thanks to an individual who was at that time very young, a fairly junior executive, W.W. Nobody used his first and middle name, William Wallace, but W.W. Atterbury, who was, I think, the most innovative manager in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, at least in the 20th century, in terms of his sort of ability to use a modern phrase, think outside the box, to imagine railroad management in new ways. And Atterbury was very, very much aware of the value of public relations. And he worked closely with Lee. They became friends, in fact. And they had a very, very similar sort of philosophy of business and public relations. They both felt that public relations was not lying to the American people, not manipulating them, but rather setting the record straight, counteracting the incendiary, inaccurate, misleading propaganda of muckraking journalists and other critics of big business at a time when American capitalism, well, in fact, global capitalism, was under threat from radical political ideas, be they socialism, communism, anarchism, and particularly in the years immediately following World War One, uh, following the rise of the Bolshevism and the Soviet Union and so forth, Ivy Lee and Atterbury both felt that they had a duty to save American big business capitalism, and in so doing, save democracy itself, because they thought that the two were inextricably intertwined, that economic freedom and political freedom were one and the same, and that anything that undermined the autonomy of business executives, particularly any form of governmental intervention in business activities, was simply leading the country down the slippery slope toward Bolshevism. And so both Atterbury and Lee were extremely vocal in that. Um, and so, Lee, I think more so than Lowy, was very much influential in the development of the Pennsylvania Railroad sort of managerial philosophy.
And is this a good bridge to get into, sorry, since we're talking about how the railroad interacts with the public, is this a good segue to get into part two then, wired, which I assume is electrification.
Yes, indeed. Wired is very much about electrification. And here again is an example of how the Pennsylvania Railroad is a world leader in adopting new technologies. And in particular, we're talking here about the electrification of the Pennsylvania Railroad main line between New York and Washington, and ultimately from Philadelphia west to Harrisburg, plus lots and lots of branch lines, things like that, which was at the time was completed in the late 1930s, the most extensive electrification project in the world. And we think of European railways or perhaps Chinese or Japanese railways today as these sort of high-tech leaders in electrification and high-speed rail operations, which they are. But in the 1920s and 1930s, it was the Pennsylvania Railroad that led the way. And it's often held up as an example of what private enterprise and unfettered capitalism can do. But the reality is that the Pennsylvania Railroad depended heavily on government assistance in all this, first from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and then from the Public Works Administration as part of these kind of New Deal programs to stimulate the American economy and to undertake what a later generation might call shovel-ready infrastructure projects. And so the government's assistance was critical, but we should also not underestimate the willingness of managers like Atterbury to take a significant risk in adopting what was by the late 1920s a fairly proven technological system, but still one that had never been kind of scaled up to that level.
Can you give us a sense of how extreme of a scaling up this was?
Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad adopted electrification in a fairly small, I guess I shouldn't say small way because it was a pioneering installation in a lot of respects, when it undertook the New York improvements, which involved tunnels under the Hudson River and East River, and of course through Manhattan underneath Penn Station, where steam locomotives simply could not operate. And so, in the very early years of the 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad needed to electrify a relatively short stretch of track between Manhattan Transfer and the New Jersey Meadowlands and Long Island. And the question then was whether they should adopt the kind of more familiar and proven technology of low voltage, third rail, direct current electrification, or undertake high voltage electrification using alternating current and overhead wires, that is catenary. And the New Haven was at the same time experimenting with high voltage electrification from Manhattan all the way north eventually to New Haven. And George Gibbs, who was a consulting engineer on electrical matters for the New York improvements, was very much intrigued with the potential of high voltage alternating current electrification. But he said it's too risky at this particular moment. It's not yet a proven technology. For our purposes, we better go with low voltage DC. That's the story I tell in the last chapter of volume one. And then, we now come to the more recent period. Um, not in New York, but in Philadelphia, where the Pennsylvania Railroad is facing constraints on the capacity of Broad Street Station in Center City, Philadelphia, which is a stub end terminal, which means trains have to back in or back out. And that's a bit of a problem for long distance trains, but it's a real problem for commuter trains to places like, Paoli on the main line west of the city. And so the solution there is to electrify the suburban lines, and this is the 19 teens now. And by this time, the kinks have been worked out of high voltage alternating current electrification. And so Gibbs says, yeah, I think it's realistic now to do this, particularly since electrifying the suburban lines around Philadelphia will give us not only a kind of test bed, but also a head start in what I think is going to be possible, and that is electrifying the entire network of lines between New York and Washington someday. Now, saying that, there was a lot of kind of debate going on within the ranks of Pennsylvania Railroad executives about the area where electrification would be most worthwhile. And there was a lot of work being done, a lot of studies being done on electrifying not along the East Coast, what we call today the Northeast Corridor, but rather the more mountainous terrain from Altoona west of Pittsburgh. And various studies were done, undertaken to see if it would be economically viable to electrify those lines. And it really wasn't until the mid to late 1920s that Pennsylvania Road executives said, we need to shift our focus and not think about electrifying that mountainous terrain in western Pennsylvania, but instead look at the much more higher traffic density lines along the Atlantic seaboard, because what we're facing now is competition from trucks, from highway vehicles. And so if we can't figure out a way of speeding up our freight and passenger service between New York and Washington, we're going to continue to lose business to the highways. And so that became the driving force behind the shift in focus from electrifying the western part of the system, which never got done, to the eventually the route between New York and Washington.
Right. I think that's an interesting consideration going forward into time because it seems like just about everybody who's owned a railroad out to Pittsburgh from Philadelphia has studied electrifying it, but has never been able to get beyond its current terminus in Harrisburg.
Absolutely. And as many people are probably aware, when Penn Central came into being, it continued to operate the Pennsylvania Railroad electrified network. So did Conrail when it took over from Penn Central in 1976. but Conrail subsequently de-energized a large portion of the Pennsylvania Railroad's electrified system, the freight lines. And today, the electric network really only applies to the Amtrak Northeast Corridor between New York and Washington, and the so-called Keystone Corridor to Harrisburg, as well as a few commuter lines. And so um, the far from expanding the Pennsylvania Railroad network, it's been cut back significantly. And the reason there is something that in the 1920s, people like Atterbury were just beginning to envision. That's diesel locomotives. And diesel locomotives, of course, are electrics. This is something I guess we can talk about more in the power chapter. But diesels made widespread electrification largely unnecessary. And so once dieselization happened, that was really the end of the studies of electrification elsewhere because the capital investment is enormous, right? The building towers, stringing catenary, and so forth. And the other issue too that kind of swung the balance away from the route between Altoona and Pittsburgh was that at that time there was no commercial power grid in Western Pennsylvania. And so, in addition to the capital cost associated with building catenary towers, stringing wire, and so forth, the Pennsylvania Railroad would have to build basically from scratch an electrical power generating system. Whereas in the East, thanks in part to things like the Safe Harbor Dam and so on, the Susquehanna, there was already in the late 1920s a pretty robust commercial power grid that the Pennsylvania Railroad could and did tap into, which greatly lowered their capital costs and greatly increased the reliability, the robustness of their system.
Right. I think this era is just so interesting too because it, like you said, provides the footprint for so many of today's electrified rail services in the United States, period.
Absolutely. It's an era of enormous possibility, of enormous potential, an era where things are clearly changing thanks to highway travel and in a very small way, aviation. Um, when the American consumer society is emerging, and everybody knows that the world is kind of shifting on its axis, but nobody is quite sure where things are going to end up. And so it's a great age for optimism, for experimentation. Atterbury is very much willing to try out new ideas. Some of them work out well, some of them don't. It's an idea of potential for the railroads, but potential that unfortunately, in many cases, is not realized.
Right. So we see that famed GG1 come about in this era and stay on the rails until the 1981, 1982.
Yes, I mean it was a remarkable piece of equipment. Some would argue that it's the finest electric locomotive ever designed, and I would agree with that. I mean, given the technological constraints of the very early 1930s when it was developed, it is a remarkable piece of technology. Um, One that had a certain amount of blowback. In other words, be careful what you wish for, and I don't want to give away too much about the power chapter, but that the misapplied lessons, let's say, at the
Hmm.
GG1 figure prominently in that story.
Right. Well, let's talk about the adversaries chapter so we can get to the power chapter.
Okay. Yeah. So in the late 1930s into the 1940s, um, the Pennsylvania Railroad was facing, as I said, kind of a very much changed world. A world when, regulatory policy was shifting, but not as much as it probably needed to. Um, Government regulators were very much kind of locked into a progressive era paradigm that assumed that the railroad industry itself was essentially invincible and that their job was to protect each railroad from each other railroad. And that kind of regulatory paradigm never really fully appreciated the effects of highway competition and that sort of thing. Um, but beyond that, um, the Pennsylvania Railroad was confronting changes in American society that we see from the benefit of kind of our historical perspective were extraordinarily beneficial in terms of, changing roles for women, African Americans, Hispanics, and so forth. And much of that came about as a result of World War II. Wars, of course, create labor shortages. The World War One did, and resulted in the hiring temporarily of large numbers of African American and female workers, but even more so World War II. Um, and there was such a profound shortage of labor that Pennsylvania railroad executives were desperate for workers. And so they not only hired women and African Americans in unprecedented numbers, but also Mexican immigrants. These were individuals who came to the United States under the kind of transportation version of the Bracero or guest worker program. And the hiring of these individuals was certainly done on a kind of racially, ethnically, and in terms of gender, segregated basis. And so there was no expectation that these individuals would be long-term employees or that they would challenge native-born white workers for the really high-paying, high-skilled jobs. But in the kind of chaos of the wartime labor markets, many of these individuals, many women, African Americans, Mexican immigrants, and so forth, did take on jobs that um, native-born white workers perceived as a threat to them. And so there was a lot of effort by railway labor unions to demand that white native-born workers were first among equals, that their unions protect them. And I should point out what people may not fully understand today is that the railroad brotherhoods, like the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen, and so forth, they had in their charters stipulations that membership was restricted to native-born white individuals only. So these unions had no desire nor intent to protect the rights of anyone else. And there were other problems too associated with the fact that many Pennsylvania railroad workers were inducted into the armed forces. Um, Now, in the railroad business, especially for operating employees, seniority is everything. The hiring date, the initial hiring date is absolutely important. And so railroad workers were very, very concerned when they went into the military about, stopping the seniority clock, particularly when newly hired women in particular, and also African Americans to some extent, were accruing seniority of their own. And so there were long discussions about whether or not those seniority rosters could be commingled, whether or not women would be able to keep their jobs when the war ended, and the answer basically was no. Um, and this did cause an adversarial relationship, really, I think, between Pennsylvania Railroad executives and Pennsylvania Railroad workers, especially native-born whites, um, as well as progressively increasing wages and fringe benefit packages, which were appropriate, I think, certainly as a mechanism of retaining labor during the war, but which, again, is one of these things that came back to haunt the railroad in the years after the war when circumstances were very different.
Right. And Alf, I might ask you if you used another small Pennsylvania Railroad adjacent collection at Hagley. I don't know how available it might have been at the time you were conducting this research, but we have a small series of interviews with women workers on the Pennsylvania Railroad that provide, among other things, a very granular street level view, so to speak, of how these conflicts played out on the Paoli local in particular.
Yes, I did, and that's a fabulous resource. And I'll say that, as I mentioned a minute or two ago, this story played out in World War One as well. And so there are a number of women workers, and there's some fascinating photos at the Hagley of women workers in these kind of, they were literally called womanalls, as in coveralls, but for women, these baggy, sort of shapeless, because of course this is the 19 teens, and sexual propriety suggests that you don't reveal any aspect of a woman's, physical appearance, her body shape. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad assigned these womanalls to female workers in shops, which must have been incredibly dangerous, right? Because you think about working around machinery, baggy clothing and things getting caught. I can only imagine. Um, but more substantively, there was during World War One an effort by the federal government to protect, and I use that word kind of in quotation marks, to protect the welfare of female employees. It was known as the Women's Service Section of the United States Railroad Administration. And it was run by a woman called Pauline Goldmark, who knew about as much about the working class as I do about rocketry. She was a Bryn Mawr College graduate. She was clearly from the elite. Um, her sister was married to Louis Brandeis, right? So, she's part of this kind of, intellectual progressive elite. And her concern is not, repeat, not to make sure that women get equal pay for equal work or that they have an opportunity for promotion or a lifetime career. Her concern was protecting the virtue of women from being sullied by exposure to the rough and tumble and very much male dominated workplace. And much of what we know, much of the information we have about women on the Pennsylvania Railroad during World War One comes from her, Pauline Goldmark, from the records of the Women's Service section, and from various government investigative reports. In other words, top down, right? From kind of upper middle class individuals who are sort of imparting their perspective, their worldview on working class women. And so it's a challenge to kind of read against the grain in those records and see what might be really going on. And with the collections you mentioned, in World War II, we have a very different perspective because we have the kind of bottom up approach. We have women who are recounting their experiences. Now, many of these women are being interviewed like decades after the war. And of course, people's memories change over time, but it's still a fascinating perspective. And what these women are basically saying is, you know, we can kind of take care of ourselves in the workplace. For one thing, many of these women grew up in railroad families, right? They had fathers, brothers, husbands, whatever it is, who worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they were familiar with the noise, the dirt, the danger, the excitement of railroading. They were used to kind of coarse and vulgar language and off-color humor and those kinds of things. They were used to an industrial workplace. And they said, we can stand up for ourselves. And in some cases, they were like aghast at how much more competent they were, because again, they're from railroading families, than some of these new hires. And with so many men in the armed forces, the Pennsylvania Railroad was hiring anybody, including what management called riffraff labor. In other words, drunks, drifters, people who under normal circumstances found it very difficult to hold down a job. Um, and there was one interview in which a female Pennsylvania Railroad employee is complaining. She says, there's this kind of no account riffraff worker man who was pounding on things with a hammer, smashed his thumb with a hammer. So they took him off to the infirmary, bandaged it up, came back, and then an hour or two later, he hit his hand with the hammer. And I hope somebody took the hammer away from him because he was not qualified to have a hammer or any other tool. He was a danger to himself and others. And so there are plenty of examples of women kind of, showing their competence, standing up for themselves, um, and just refusing to be kind of dictated to by men um, who found their presence in the workplace unfamiliar and a bit uncomfortable. And but they said a lot too about, how it wasn't there were cases that they said of overt discrimination. There were cases of sexual harassment. Not as many as you might expect, but again, it's hard to say whether their interviews 30 or so years later are really accurately recalling what happened. But what they really said was it was just kind of this sort of unconscious unwillingness to acknowledge the presence of women in the workplace. So basic things like having bathrooms and changing rooms for female employees. Managers just sort of didn't think to provide those. They said, well, there's a bathroom in the railroad station. It's a quarter mile away, but just that go there if you need to go, right? Because we don't have time to set up new facilities just for you, particularly when you'll be gone, right? In a couple of years and the war is over. And so uh, there was a lot of kind of resentment by women who said, well, what do you mean I'll be gone in a few years? I'm doing a good job. I'm working hard. I like this. And you
Hmm.
see this over and over again. And again, these are the survivors to some extent, the ones that are interviewed later and who still have careers for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and even in some cases continue on to the Penn Central and Conrail years. They're the ones who are tough enough to make it. They're the ones who are deeply invested in having a railroad career and so forth. And they're the ones who I think were most resentful at being told, yeah, when the war is over, thank you very much, ma'am, but please go home and, get married, have kids, and all the more traditional kind of female gender roles. And, they're the ones who had the fortitude to kind of keep pushing and saying, I'm going to keep working here at a job that I enjoy doing and for money that I need to support myself and my family.
Hmm. Yes, one of the women who talked, she had lost her husband, I think, from an infection he acquired after having his wisdom teeth removed. Not even someone who passed in the conflict. And it's also interesting too. Admittedly, I'm going a little bit beyond the strict Pensy archives at Hagley, but we have some material from the Reading collections from 69, 70, 1969, 1970, where they're talking about how do we figure in women's facilities, like that this is an issue that persists for the next 25 years and onward, of course.
Yes, and there's actually a nice article, a secondary source written by Ruth Oldenziel, in which she talks about the importance of bathrooms. I mean, if you look at the Pennsylvania Railroad correspondence, executives are spending an inordinate amount of time talking about bathroom facilities and so forth. And we're not talking about, blueprints and things for putting in a woman's bathroom in some shop building. We're talking about, the number of complaints that they're getting about inadequate bathroom facilities. And of course, gender is only one aspect, so is race. And so the issue then becomes, well, not only now do we have women in a previously male workspace, but we also have African American women in a previously white workspace. And so, how is all that going to play out in terms of not only gender segregation but also racial segregation? And you mentioned that a number of these women had husbands or their family members who had died or been seriously injured. It's a dangerous workplace. I mean, the war, of course, is going on, so men are off at war and sometimes don't come home. But men are dying on the job. Um, it's a hazardous environment. And there aren't a lot of social safety nets here in terms of protecting individuals, like Social Security, disability, and so forth. These kinds of mechanisms are only beginning to be put into place. And so one of the things that the Pennsylvania Railroad and I'm assuming the Reading and other companies did as well was to help out the wives or family members of injured or dead employees by giving them a job on the railroad and a chance to earn some money. I mean, never as much money as, say, a husband who was an engineman would have earned, but at least something. And interestingly, that happened on an executive level too. There was no women's service section. There was no USRA during World War II, but Pennsylvania Railroad executives were sensitive to the public relations value, and they did, by the way, promote women as instrumental to the war effort. There's a famous poster called Molly Pitcher, 1944, and I think many people are familiar with the original Molly Pitcher, Mary Hayes Macaulay, who, according to legend, took over a cannon in the American Revolutionary War after her husband was injured and contributed to the American, independence movement. And so this is the kind of World War II version of it, showing a woman, throwing a switch. It's actually a version of a photograph taken in a Long Island Railroad yard during World War II. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was, I mean, literally advertising, promoting the contributions of women to the war effort, which of course left them in a kind of tricky position because they're going to have to walk that back when the war ended. But that was true of the federal government as well, with their Rosie the Riveter campaign and that kind of thing. Um, but in addition to that, the Pennsylvania Railroad had, for each of its geographic regions, a sort of coordinator of female employees. Someone who, again, their job was not to make sure women had equal pay for equal work, but to make sure that women were receiving access to bathroom facilities, that they weren't victims of sexual harassment, that they were behaving in an appropriate manner. Um, and those coordinators of female employees were the wives of Pennsylvania Railroad managers who had been injured or killed on the job. So at both the worker level and the management level, the Pennsylvania Railroad is relying on women who are often being given these jobs as a sort of um, mechanism to help them cope with the loss of a breadwinner. It's certainly not sufficient, but at least it does indicate that Pennsylvania Railroad executives have a social conscience, that they're not merely looking at labor as a factor input as part of their cost benefit analyses.
All right. And hmm, I know I'm kind of losing some of the thematic thread here, but how does this persist through some of the other uh, conflicts and social movements covered in this 33 to 68 era, the civil rights movement? Is there any large impact from, say, Korea or Vietnam?
Um, well, I think World War II is the pivotal period, not only for Pennsylvania Railroad employees, but also for Pennsylvania Railroad passengers. And we're not so much talking here about gender as we are about race. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad did serve several segregated states, but not to any significant degree. Maryland had racial segregation, although it was far less comprehensive and far less enforced than it was in the Deep South. Um, the Pennsylvania Railroad had very small amount of service in Virginia, but not passenger service, which is what is at issue here. The Pennsylvania Railroad did serve St. Louis, which was in a segregated state, but again, that was only for the very, very short distance from Illinois across the Mississippi River. And so on that level, the Pennsylvania Railroad is not affected by these uh, attempts to overturn Jim Crow segregationist legislation in the South. Having said that, the Pennsylvania Railroad does indirectly have passenger service to the South because it is hauling trains like the Silver Meteor and so forth, the Crescent, from New York City, from Penn Station, as far as Washington, where they're turned over to companies like the Southern, like the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, and so forth, that take those trains farther south into states that very definitely are segregated. And so there is but the issue then is one of managing passengers. And so the policy of the Pennsylvania Railroad is to segregate passengers boarding in New York City, which is there's no legally enforced segregation in New York State. But the idea is that it's better to segregate passengers at the beginning than to have to reshuffle everybody when they get to Washington and when the train is then ready to head into Virginia, and to make people take new seats in the whites only car or the car for African Americans. And several African Americans protest this. They say, show me the law that says I have to sit in this specific seat in New York or in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Um, and they enlist the aid of the NAACP. And the NAACP is initially a bit reluctant to take on this, but they eventually see that this is an opening wedge to attacking racial segregation in railroad transportation throughout the country. And so, it's a long and complicated story, but in the end, the Pennsylvania Railroad agrees to abandon its informal, not legally enforced practice of racial segregation um, between New York and Washington. Um, at the same time, there's a lot of pressure, not from the federal level, not yet, but from the state level, especially New York, an agency called CADE, the Commission Against Discrimination in Employment. And CADE is very aggressive in demanding that the Pennsylvania Railroad hire African American employees in New York State and to promote them to positions beyond that of sort of manual labor, working in, freight yards and so forth. Um, Final thought before we move on, and that is, the notion of racial segregation in transportation is horrific and absurd. I mean, it is incomprehensible to us today. We mentioned Raymond Loewy before. Um, for some Pennsylvania Railroad trains, like the Southwind and the Jeffersonian, which was an all-coach streamliner that traveled between New York and St. Louis, they both carried dining cars, of course. And Raymond Loewy developed, at the request of Pennsylvania Railroad executives, a curtain, kind of, I imagine it must have looked kind of like a shower curtain on a chromium plated rod that ran around one table in the dining car. And so when the dining car entered Kentucky on the South Wind, if an African American patron wanted to be served a meal under the terms of, Plessy versus Ferguson, the so-called separate but equal policy, they would be seated at that one table in the dining car, and the curtain would be drawn around them to screen them from white patrons in the dining car. So this African American family or African American individual could eat in the dining car, served by African American waiters, with a meal prepared by African American cooks, but they would be isolated from the rest of the dining car. And there was one on the Jeffersonian too, although again, because it was only that short distance, a couple miles, across the Mississippi River into Union Station, St. Louis, that was ever used. But I mean, that was the horror and the insanity, really, of that whole practice of racial segregation. So that's now you mentioned Korea and Vietnam. Korea, there's much less in terms of the effect of it's a very different conflict than World War II. And so there's not as much hiring of temporary labor like women and African Americans. The issue in Korea is really more of disputes within or between management and labor. And organized labor, the railroad brotherhoods, are kind of emboldened by their success in getting higher wages and benefits in World War II. And they continue that policy in the post-war period. They're well aware of the rollback of benefits for workers in terms of wages and so on that occurred after World War One. They don't want to see that again, right? They don't want to retrench. And so they keep demanding higher and higher wages and fringe benefits, particularly indexed wages, right? So when the cost of living goes up, there's an automatic kind of escalator clause in their wages. And that becomes an issue in the Korean War when there are labor shortages, when prices are going up, and the federal government is anxious to kind of keep a lid on inflation. And certainly railroad executives are trying to contain their labor costs. And so workers are engaging in economic brinksmanship, threatening to strike during a war, right? Which is going to be tremendously disruptive to the American war effort and could potentially put American lives, American soldiers at risk. And management in league with the federal government is saying, anyone who countenances a strike during wartime is essentially a traitor to this country. And so it's more of a rhetorical battle than anything else, but it indicates the extent to which executives and workers are really becoming adversarial and confrontational, particularly because it becomes clear. It's easy to grant higher wages when business is increasing, when revenues are increasing, when things are looking good. But by the time of the Korean War, it's becoming more and more obvious that things are not looking good, that the railroad industry is in systemic decline. And so everybody is scrambling to hold on to what they have. And I think the sense that if we don't fight for what we have now, to preserve what we have now, then the future is going to look pretty bleak. And so I think that it accounts for a lot of the intensity of labor management conflict during the Korean War and after the Korean War. Vietnam, not so much. I mean, by the time Vietnam really escalates, the issue is, the merger and so forth. We can
Mhm.
talk about Metroliner later on and why, Metroliner is in some way collateral damage with the American military buildup in Vietnam and the lack of government support for high-speed transportation and so forth.
Oh yeah. No, I definitely want to talk about the Metro liner when the time comes. But moving on to power.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite chapters of the book. I like, again, it's one of these one-word titles, and I like the symbolism because we're talking here about literally power, motive power, locomotives, but we're also talking about the shift of power within the organization, which I think is an equally important story, and the two of them are very much connected. Now, I mentioned before the GG1 was, sort of the law of unintended consequences. I talked about Theodore Ely's small engine philosophy. By the 1930s, he's long gone. Okay. So the issue then in the 1930s is how is the Pennsylvania Railroad going to cope with a changing transportation landscape, in particular the highway network? And by the 1930s, it's already clear that short haul passenger traffic, 50 miles or so, that's disappearing. I mean, the automobile is taking that over. So the Pennsylvania Railroad has no interest in holding on to these short distance branch line passenger trains. But there's still a big market for long distance intercity passenger travel among business executives. And also as the nation begins to kind of crawl its way out of the Great Depression, among this group of people called, tourists, right? Leisure travelers who don't have to go from New York to Chicago, but who want to for fun or to see relatives or something. And at the same time, there's the development of these new streamlined passenger trains, right? In the early 1930s, mid 1930s, like the Union Pacific's M10,000, more famously the Burlington Zephyr, that are modern and shiny. They're powered by internal combustion engines, so no smoke. And they have these Art Deco stylings and so forth. It's the wave of the future. It's something that gives Americans a sense of confidence and optimism in the midst of the Great Depression, an expectation of a better, literally brighter, literally a shinier future, right? I mean, the Zephyr is just a shiny
Hmm.
stainless steel thing that goes zipping by at 100 miles an hour. Um, this is the future, right? And Atterbury sees this as the future. I mean, he praises the Zephyr. He thinks it's a really great idea. And other people, like his subordinate and successor, Martin Clement, who becomes president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1935, he is not so sure about that. He says the Zephyr is only an option for railroads, which he says, for thin traffic. And in that sense, he's right because trains like the M10,000, the Zephyr, they serve very sparsely settled areas in the West, right? Union Pacific to Burlington, they don't have the same kind of passenger traffic density that the Pennsylvania Railroad has. And if anybody's ever been to Chicago, to the Museum of Science and Industry, they have a beautiful display of the Zephyr. And you can go in it. I mean, I'm 6'2". I had to duck to get in. It's amazing how small that train is compared to a conventional passenger equipment. And so Clement is right in the sense that the Zephyr never could have handled, I don't know, traffic between New York and Chicago, and all the trains that went back and forth there. But he is also very kind of pedestrian in his outlook. He sees what is, not what could be. Atterbury saw what could be. He saw the potential of trains like the Zephyr. But by 1934, Atterbury is very ill. He's dying of cancer, really. And it's Clement who's running the company. And of course, Clement does become officially president in 1935. And so Clement says, no more experiments with this, the fancy stuff that Atterbury favored, including things like intermodal transportation. That's not what we do. We're a railroad company. We follow conventional methods here. But Clement is aware of the potential for increased passenger traffic. He is aware of competition from other railroads like New York Central. And there's always this rivalry. The 20th Century Limited is the gold standard for passenger service between New York and Chicago. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad, never is as successful with the Broadway Limited, um, as the New York Central is the 20th Century Limited. And there's in fact even talk about discontinuing the Broadway Limited during the Great Depression as an economy measure because so few people are riding it. And there's a great memo, as Pennsylvania Railroad executives are saying, yeah, but if we discontinue the Broadway, what we're really saying to the public is that we're a second tier railroad like the Baltimore and Ohio,
Mm.
not the railroad like the New York Central. So we got to keep it on as a basically a public relations gesture. Um, so, Clement is looking to improve the Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger service. He sees the potential of this new streamlined passenger equipment that companies like Pullman Standard are building. And he then convenes what's called a unit train committee that consists of Pennsylvania Railroad officials. It consists of George Gibbs, right? He's still around, the guy who was responsible for electrification of the New York improvements and so forth. Raymond Loewy's on it, right? And they send him off in a room somewhere with his drafting pen to develop all these like utterly unrealistic designs for double-deck passenger equipment and for a flashy streamliner that will go between New York and Washington, and another one that will go between New York and Chicago. Um, and Baldwin, right? Baldwin Locomotive Works is the principal supplier of Pennsylvania Railroad's motive power other than Altoona. And it's a bad time to involve Baldwin because Baldwin's bankrupt. It's
Mhm.
been badly managed. It's overextended when it moved from Center City, Philadelphia down to Eddystone. Um, it's victim of a hostile takeover battle. The company's a mess. And the company's executives, like Samuel Volklin and so on, who's chairman of the board, they have no interest whatsoever in diesels. I mean, they do embrace them to a certain extent. They begin in a small way experimenting with diesels, but that, you know, doesn't really end well. And they keep saying over and over again, these Baldwin executives, steam is the way of the future. I mean, Volklin said in 1930, right? Steam power will be as common in 1980 as it is today. And I'm sure there are plenty of rail fans out there who would love to have had, you know, omnipresent steam locomotives crisscrossing the American railroad network in 1980, but, you know, that didn't pan out. And there's another Baldwin executive salesman named Robert Binkard who delivered a speech called "Treadeth Not the Ox," or no, I'm sorry, I got the title wrong. Muzzle not the ox that treadeth out the corn. It's from Deuteronomy, I think. It's a biblical verse in which he's basically saying, why would we want to move away from the steam locomotives that has served us so well for so many years? Stick with what we know. Instead of these flashy streamliners like the Zephyr, that's what the public wants. But the public's stupid, right? They don't know how railroads really operate. And if we submit to the will of the traveling public, we're going to waste money on these flashy streamliners that simply don't work. And he said that to an audience of railroad officials in New York, a traffic club. And to be fair, most of them kind of thought he'd taken leave of his senses, but that's what Baldwin is promoting. And that's the partner for the Pennsylvania Railroad. At the same time, all of these very talented executives like Vogt and Ely and Kiesel and so on, um, they're either have, you know, long since dead or retiring. And there's a new generation of motive power officials in the Pennsylvania Railroad who are capable enough, but they lack vision. They're more draftsmen than they are engineers, design engineers, mechanical engineers. Um, and so they're susceptible to the entreaties of Baldwin. Um, and the problem they face is they say first, okay, let's deal with the problem at hand for right now. The future is going to be electrification, right? We've done such a good job with the northeastern electrification. Eventually, at some time in the future, we're going to electrify, you know, at least as far west as Pittsburgh, maybe all the way to Chicago. But in the meantime, we need a powerful steam locomotive that's essentially the equivalent of the GG1 for non-electrified territory that can haul a very heavy train at very high speeds west of Harrisburg. That's what we're going to go for. And even at the time, George Gibbs put up his hand and said, whoa, whoa, wait a minute, wait a minute. Stop right there. Two problems. Number one, think about all this streamlined passenger equipment that's coming online. It's lighter than conventional passenger equipment. If you buy more streamlined passenger cars, you lower the weight of your passenger trains, and your locomotive does not need to be as powerful as the design you're proposing. You don't need that much power. And he said the other problem is this: you want a locomotive that can go 100 miles an hour pulling passenger trains. It's not the locomotive that's the problem, it's your right of way. It's the tracks, it's the roadbed, the curvature, the grades. That's the limiting factor. And by the way, in anticipation of our conversation about the Metro liner, um, that was also the problem in the Northeast Corridor. The vehicle, right, the actual cars of the Metroliner eventually made it to 150 plus miles an hour. They could do that. The roadbed couldn't because it was 100 years out of date. And so Gibbs warned them. He said, this is not the right thing to do. They didn't listen to him. And so what they did is they became infatuated with this thing called duplex technology, right? Got to understand, steam locomotives, big, heavy, large drivers, right? The drive wheels of a passenger locomotive are very large because the larger the driver, the greater the speed. It's a basically, um, direct relationship there. The problem is large drivers, they tend to pound the rails. It's called dynamic augment. They're literally going up and down in addition to going forward, and they're just sort of pounding the tracks into the dirt, um, which is bad, right? And so one way of reducing dynamic augment is to kind of use multiple cylinders and to kind of break up the sets of drivers into two sets. It's called duplex locomotive technology. Anyway. Um, and the other thing that they adopt is a mechanism for regulating the emission of steam into the cylinders of the locomotives. And again, it's a complicated story, but they rely on something called poppet valves, which are actually borrowed from the Italian automobile industry and so forth. And they said between the duplex technology, between the duplex design and the poppet valves, we're going to have world beaters. Um, but it's largely experimental. They build one prototype, the S1, called the Big Engine, which is styled by Raymond Loewy, goes on display at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Ooh, ah, right. And it's a pretty impressive engine. It's the biggest non-articulated locomotive ever built. It can move 100 miles an hour. It can pull heavy trains and so forth. It's designed as a kind of one-off that leads to the development of other duplex designs like the T1, which does incorporate the poppet valves, which Raymond Loewy does design. There are two prototypes called the Buck Gordon and the Flash Rogers. Sorry, the Flash Gordon and the Buck Rogers. Again, modern space age, cutting edge technology. Um, they don't work. I mean, not well. I mean, they can when everything goes right, they can pull a heavy train over long distances at high speeds. But there are a lot of teething problems, which you'd expect with a new technology. Now, by this time, it's World War II, and the Pennsylvania Railroad is facing unprecedented traffic demands, right? They need locomotives, they need them quickly, both freight power and passenger power. And into this equation steps a guy who becomes very important in the Pennsylvania Railroad history, um, named James Sims. And Sims is, well, he's an outsider from the very beginning. He's brought to the Pennsylvania Railroad because he plays baseball. He's a shortstop. Um, and he's essentially a ringer for the Pennsylvania Railroad, corporate baseball team. They start him out as a freight clerk. He works his way up very rapidly through the managerial hierarchy. And then in the 1930s, he's sort of farmed out as a liaison to the Association of American Railroads in Washington, D.C. So that gets him away from the insularity of the Pennsylvania Railroad's headquarters in Philadelphia, and it exposes him to executives from numerous other railroads, including companies like the Baltimore and Ohio that are beginning to experiment with diesel locomotives. Then, after he's done there, they send him in 1935 out west of Chicago, which is about as far away from Philadelphia as you can get. Again, he's away from the corporate headquarters, and Chicago is the nation's premier railroad gateway. Almost every railroad kind of converges in Chicago. And he then interacts with executives like those on the Burlington and the Union Pacific and the Santa Fe who say, we're experimenting with diesels too. And they actually work pretty good. So he's receptive to new ideas in a way that people like Martin Clement in Philadelphia are not. And Sims becomes vice president of the Western region, which extends from Crestline, right, which is in kind of the middle of Ohio,
Hmm.
all the way west to Chicago, and also then from Columbus, Ohio, to St. Louis. And this is the area where a lot of these big duplex locomotives are going to operate, pulling passenger trains at high speeds. And Sims does not want to be stuck with a lemon, right? He says, you're going to give me these locomotives, they don't work. I'm the one who's going to have to explain the poor operating results and the lack of profitability here. So let's take another look at this. And he says, okay, we've got the two T1 prototypes, right? Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Um, I'm not impressed really with them. Maybe there's another option. So the Pennsylvania Railroad borrows, at Sims' insistence, a steam locomotive from the Norfolk and Western, right? A J1, which is one of them is still preserved, not the one they borrow, but um, Norfolk and Western has a very close relationship. In fact, it's about a third owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Sims says, get one of those locomotives here, we'll test it. And they do. And it works very well. It's as good or better than the T1. And Sim says it's an off-the-shelf design. We can just build plenty of these, right? We know how to do that. We don't need to spend any more time and effort developing the T1. And so people in the motive power department are, no, 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 we're going to put this thing on the test plant, right? In Altoona test plant, scientifically monitor its performance. And on the test plant, the thing is a world beater. The T1 turns in impressive results. And Sims it says, I don't care what it does in the test plant. What I want to know is how does it do on the actual railroad, right? Which is not good. At the same time, Pennsylvania Railroad needs freight power. And so they, as an emergency stopgap measure, arrange with the Chesapeake and Ohio to have the design, the blueprints, right? Just hand it over for a large freight locomotive. And they build 125 of these at the Altoona Works. Um, and the locomotive works very well. In fact, better than the freight version of the duplex, which is a Q2, which is in under development. And here again, Sim says, why in the world do we want to waste resources developing an unproven design when the thing that we've borrowed from another railroad actually works? And by the way, I agree with you that steam locomotives are not going to be around forever. But where I disagree with you is this. You say eventually we're going to electrify the tracks west of Harrisburg. I say eventually we're going to dieselize the trains west of Harrisburg. In either case, we don't need these innovative new steam locomotive designs. Put it away. While the motor power department won't hear about it, there's big debates here. Sims tries to block production of the T1 to ensure that only the first two are built. He fails. And so 50 more are built. They're the last steam locomotives ever built by the Altoona Works. Last steam locomotives are delivered by Baldwin to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Um, he fails to block production of an initial batch of the Q2 freight locomotive. But when the motive power department says we need a whole bunch more Q2 locomotives for freight service, Sims loses it completely. He says, "That's enough. I've had it. This is an Armageddon moment here, not just for me, but for the railroad. Because if we keep going down this path of designing and building new steam locomotives, we're going to bankrupt the company." And his timing is impeccable because in 1946, the Pennsylvania Railroad loses money for the first time in its history, has negative operating income, which is all the more embarrassing because it's centennial year. And that, of course, attracts the attention of the investment banking community. And today, anybody familiar with the railroad industry will say, Wall Street is at war with the railroads because they want fundamentally different things. Wall Street wants quarterly profits, efficiency, cost containment, low operating ratio, And railroad executives understand it's not the quarterly, it's the 20-year time horizon. And so executives want to invest in the physical plant, hire employees, keep them on the payroll and so forth. Um, isn't it a shame that in the good old days, Wall Street was not meddling in the affairs of the railroads? Well, they did in the 1940s, because investment bankers said, this is not good. And they were very critical of PRR management, and they pointed in particular to the unwillingness of the Pennsylvania Railroad to dieselize. And that gave Sims the opening wedge he needed. And he said, see, I told you. If the investment banking community turns against us, we're in deep trouble. We have to do what they want, which coincidentally was what he wanted and also what he knew would bolster his profile within the company. So he's changing the Pennsylvania Railroad's motive power strategy, but also gaining his own power within the organization. And he does so pretty surreptitiously, because Martin Clement, who's still the president, and is kind of on the fence about dieselization, he reads some of the reports prepared by the investment bankers, and he said, something weird going on here. Their data is right, but it's proprietary. It's not public knowledge. Somebody very high up in the organization must have been releasing this information to the investment banking community. And he tries to figure out who it is. As far as I can tell, he never does. And I have no idea who within the organization released that information. But in all probability, it was Sims who was feeding confidential internal financial information to the investment bankers, knowing it was going to make his case for him. And so, long story short, um, what happens is Clement finally gives in, brings Sims to Philadelphia as the assistant vice president in charge of operations. So he's third man down in the organization. But from that point on, he's effectively running the company. He's soon promoted to vice president in charge of operations, again, running the company. Clement takes early retirement. It's a, face-saving move, right? He's made a chairman of the board of directors and so on. But, everybody understands he blew it in terms of dieselization. Um, Clement is considered not quite ready. He's too young, still in his 40s, to take over the company. Um, so he stays VP of operations. Walter Franklin, who's a traffic guy, knows nothing about, well, not nothing, but knows very little about railroad operations, takes over as an interim president. But again, Clement's running the company. He's running the dieselization program. He aggressively dieselizes the Pennsylvania Railroad. He gleefully, right, signs the death warrant for all of the duplex steam locomotives. The S1, the T1, the Q2, they all go to scrap. The S2 turbine, steam turbine locomotive. Pennsylvania Railroad is pretty good about keeping examples of its steam locomotives, but not these. These are such an embarrassment. They go to the scrapyard gone completely. Um, and in dieselizing the Pennsylvania Railroad, Sims saves the company from bankruptcy. I have no doubt that had Sims not acted the way he did when he did, the Pennsylvania Railroad would have gone bankrupt long before it was able to merge with New York Central and then go bankrupt. But of course, anticipating what we talk about in a little bit, Sims was also the chief instigator of the merger with New York Central. So he saved the company and then he kind of destroyed it in the end.
But in the interim, it looks like we've got a renewal.
We do have a renewal, and there are hopeful signs in the aftermath of World War II, that things are going to change for the better. Um, Passenger service, for one thing. There is the perception of an enormous pent-up demand for passenger travel after World War II. And so executives on the Pennsylvania Railroad are cautiously optimistic. Like most other railroads in the US, they authorize the purchase of new passenger equipment. streamlined trains. They offer new services, including transcontinental service, right, through sleeping cars that go all the way to Los Angeles, San Francisco, even as far as Mexico City for a while, because there's a perception that Americans don't want to have to change trains in Chicago or in St. Louis. And in part, they are fulfilling a very small uh, existing legitimate demand, but in part, they're responding to a public relations campaign orchestrated by Robert R. Young, who is a maverick financier, an individual who tries and, well, succeeds actually in gaining control of numerous railroads like the Chesapeake and Ohio, later, importantly, the New York Central. He tries and fails to take over the Pullman Company. And as part of that kind of campaign to take over Pullman, he accuses the railroads of an egregious sin that they had not actually committed, which is that they had failed to meet this enormous public demand for transcontinental passenger service. He's wrong about that, but perception is everything. And so the railroads respond to that. But more substantively, um, the Pennsylvania Railroad does spruce up its passenger equipment, although even then, by early 1947, perhaps even earlier, Martin Clement is saying this is not going to last. I mean, they're already seeing signs that long distance passenger traffic is beginning to decline thanks to to highway travel. And so, in hindsight, um, the decision of the railroads to invest in all of this new passenger equipment after World War II is one of the worst mistakes they ever made. I mean, I'm glad they did because it carried us over to Amtrak and so on. But it was a fundamental waste of money. Now, in terms of um, more positive developments, um, the Pennsylvania Railroad kind of again flirts with, well, dives headlong actually into intermodal operations. They did that a little bit in the 1920s and 30s, thanks to W. Atterbury. But after World War II, they began to embrace, what we often colloquially call piggyback or trailer on flat car service. There are changes in regulatory policy. There's something called the New Haven case and so forth. That is very important here. But also important here is Sims, who behind the scenes is very much pushing for um, intermodal operation, which has enormous potential. In fact, what the Pennsylvania Railroad markets as truck train is one of the few growth areas, but it also causes a feud within the organization between Sims's two most important subordinates, which is James Newell, who becomes the operations guy and who is all in on piggyback service, and Fred Carpy, who's the traffic guy, who's the VP of traffic, who is committed to conventional boxcars, less than carload lot boxcar traffic. And it's more than that. I think there just is a personality conflict between these two individuals that becomes horribly toxic. They're bitter enemies, and Sims has to deal with that and so forth. But the truck train service is very successful. It encourages the Pennsylvania Railroad to get involved in this consortium of railroads known as Trailer Train, which provides equipment for truly nationwide trailer on flat car or piggyback surface. And of course, the ultimately that evolves into the container traffic we see on railroads today. That in many respects is the kind of one of the things that has saved the railroad industry in the aftermath of deregulation. But it was just, it's only beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, and it's not yet capable of saving the PRR or other railroads that are using it.
So it does come in handy down the line.
It does. It does. And one of the tragedies is so many of the things that Pennsylvania Railroad puts in place, if they had just held on long enough, I mean, it's counterfactual history, it's speculation, but had they held on long enough, and we'll talk about David Bevan's role in that effort, um, without merging, it's entirely possible that in the aftermath of deregulation, they could have kind of been reborn as a slimmed down, yes, but still vibrant uh, Pennsylvania Railroad, which might, be, even today, that keystone might be going across Pennsylvania
On something other than a heritage unit.
on something other than a heritage unit.
So, speaking of David Bevan, do we talk about him in decline or for merger? How close are we to that?
I struggled with that, it's one of those things that particularly in this post-war period, so many people have their fingers in so many parts of the Pennsylvania Railroad's operation, and Bevan is one of those individuals. Um, I'm sorry to say that if you asked, well, I would say a person on the street probably doesn't have any idea who David Bevan is, but a person who's familiar with the Penn Central bankruptcy, and they say, if I were to say to them, name a villain, pick me one person who did this, they would say, oh, Bevan, David Bevan. And that's understandable because when things go down the drain, you blame the money guy, right? And he's the money guy. He has different titles over the years, but he's essentially the VP of Finance at Pennsylvania Railroad and later at Penn Central. But it's a shame because I think had people listened to him more, things would have been better. He comes on the scene in the 1950s. He's an example of one of these rare cases. The railroad industry is pretty insular, right? People work their way up the corporate ladder. They don't come in from elsewhere. Um, he does, and it's really Sims. I mean, effectively it's Franklin who authorizes this, but it's Sims who kind of engineers this. Sims is looking at the Pennsylvania Railroad's finances, accounting methods, budgeting. The Pennsylvania doesn't have a true, capital budget really, in the way that most companies do. And Sims says, we're about 50 years behind the times when it comes to budget forecasting. We're pretty good, right, at toting up the results of things that have already happened, in part because that's what the Interstate Commerce Commission demands that we do. But we're really not very good about anticipating where we should be next year, 5 years, 20 years down the line. And so he brings Bevan on board to sort this stuff out. And Bevan begins to take charge of Pennsylvania Railroad's kind of finances. Bevan, it's one of these things that Bevan gets there, and I think Bevan, once he got kind of looking at the book, said, "Oh my God, I knew things were bad. I didn't know how bad they were. I got a lot of work to do." And he did. He began straightening things out. His first job, one of his most important jobs, is he says, "Look, we've got very little working capital, right? Very little cash to cope with emergencies in a cyclical industry, right? Which is a problem." Um, and he said, we've also had a very high debt load, right? A lot of bonded debt. So what we've got to do is start paying down some of this debt. We've got to husband money, which means we've got to like not invest as much in the physical plant. It's a balancing act, right? But he says we've got to just try to pay down as much of this debt as we can. And that put him at odds with operating officials, right? Because operating officials, particularly when things go wrong, the first thing they say is, if we had another mainline track, more signals, more locomotives, a better bridge, blah, blah, more cars, whatever it is. In other words, give us money, throw money at the problem, that'll fix it. And Bevan is saying, we got to, no, no, there's no money. We don't have any money. We've got to have less money. We got to be more frugal, more conservative in our expenditures. And the operating people didn't like that one bit, even though he was actually right. And then as we get into the 1960s, and again, with the support of Sims, who's kind of a W.W. Atterbury version 2, although much less hostile towards labor. Um, Sims acknowledges what Bevan is saying about the need to automate, mechanize, and embrace computers. And again, this stodgy kind of traditional railroad operation is one of the first companies to adopt mainframe computers for data processing. And not only the computer, that's just a piece of equipment, but Bevan brings in people from IBM. And he says, it's about using the computer to integrate all aspects of the railroad's operation, from, waybills to invoices to budget forecasting to allocation of locomotives and crews, all of this stuff in a very primitive way, right? This is very kind of, early days of computing. But it's still, he's in the forefront of the industry. New York Central is using a computer too.
Hmm.
And there's a big story about when the merger happens, Penn Central merger, that one of them uses magnetic tapes, the other uses punch cards, and so yeah, that's a problem. But the bigger problem is this: Bevan was a big supporter of integrating the computer into all aspects of the railroad's operations. The New York Central was done in a compartmentalized basis. So it wasn't the technology so much as the way the technology was used. In any case, Bevan is in the forefront of this, which again puts him at odds with operating people because nobody likes to be quantified, right? And one of the things that Bevan is able to do with the computer is he's able to say, um, this division is performing better than that division. So that division's superintendent needs to pull up his socks and do better. And that had never been done before on a systematic kind of quantifiable level. And these divisional personnel, these divisional managers were not happy about that. At the same time, I should point out when I speak about divisions, again, this is sort of all happening at once. It's hard to pick out one thread from another. Um, Sims has this bright idea, right, which turns out to be not such a bright idea, of incentivizing the various regions of the system to improve their operating efficiency and solicit more business. So he works with a consulting company called Heller and Associates, which is originally brought on board to deal with the Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger deficits. And in fact, Heller works with the PRR and with Baltimore and Ohio and with New York Central. And the idea is, how can we coordinate passenger service? Can we turn over, say, Washington to Pittsburgh solely to the B&O and not have the PRR involved? That kind of thing. It never works well, in part because there's a lot of resistance from operating people at all these different companies. But Heller then goes on to, I mean, they are a management consulting firm after all, to advise Sims on this reorganization. And a lot of Sims's subordinates tell him it's a bad idea, it won't work. And, what often happens in business is that when a senior manager has a bright idea, they bring on a consulting firm not to educate them, but to simply reinforce the decision that they've made to give it the veneer of kind of objectivity. And I think this is what's happened here. In any case, in 1955, Sims introduces this 9 region system. And he builds it as, basically 9 railroads in one, that each, divisional vice president, each divisional kind of management structure is responsible for running their own, company within a company. It doesn't work well at all, in part because it coincides with the increase in run-through traffic. That is traffic like truck train that moves between multiple divisions. So it's a huge problem of coordination and so forth. And rather than competing for business with trucks and other railroads, these regional personnel compete against other regions, and almost to the extent where they're sabotaging each other. And so that is very quietly abandoned as a bad idea. But it's probably the worst mistake aside from supporting the merger that Sims ever made. But it shows the kind of difficulty that the Pennsylvania Railroad is facing. There are no good solutions. There are no good outcomes here, right? There are a whole bunch of options. Some are worse than others, but none of them are really going to address the core fundamental problem of unprofitable passenger service that cannot be discontinued because of ICC regulations, of truck competition, of subsidized highway competition, of high labor costs, of aging infrastructure, of low rates of return on investment. These are structural problems, and simply moving from one management system or one organizational structure to another is kind of akin to shuffling the deck chairs in the Titanic. It's not really going to have any meaningful effect. So anyway, so that's but back to Bevan. He's heavily involved and he's making enemies. He's antagonizing people. Um, and we can maybe talk later about the diversification thing, which is what kind of seals his reputation as a bad guy in this whole story, undeservedly so.
Six Flags over the Pennsylvania Railroad, right?
Well, yeah, we have Six Flags. There's one here in Atlanta, but yeah, Six Flags was not this one, but the one in Texas was briefly a part of the Pennsylvania Railroad Empire.
Yes. Is there any more to add to the conversation on the decline chapter? Are we ready to move to commutation and merger?
Well, I think in the interest of time we can perhaps move on. Yeah, I think that about covers it. Um, the final thought though about passenger services, there are these huge debates about again, the regulatory apparatus is to a certain extent caught in the past, and so are many Americans. And they say that the railroads, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, are still making money, or at least not losing very much money on their passenger service. And what they're pointing to are, above the rails costs. That is the variable costs associated with passenger service, train crews and so on. Um, but when you factor in the capital costs, the fixed costs, and allocate them among passenger and freight trains, it's a very different and very much bleaker story. Um, but there are actually six different methods of kind of allocating the costs associated with passenger operations. And of course, depending on people's perspective, they pick one allocation method or another to either say the railroads are making money on passenger service or losing a little bit of money or losing a lot of money or hemorrhaging money like a patient with a head wound and the kind of inability of all these people to agree complicates efforts to find a solution to the passenger crisis. The ICC commissions a report by Howard Hosmer. It's got a long title, but it's always called the Hosmer Report. And Hosmer says, look, basically by 1970, passenger service is going to be dead in this country unless something is done. And he misses it by 1 year, right? Because Amtrak comes in 1971. So he's very good at his predictive abilities, but it takes a lot, it takes a long time before anybody actually addresses this issue. So, but yeah, let's move on to commutation, which is also a big money loser for the Pennsylvania Railroad.
All right. So where to begin with that? Or is this the Metro liner conversation?
Oh, we can save Metroliner. Again, they're all tied in, but let's talk about the Pennsylvania Railroad operates commuter service in a number of places. They have it in one train, right? The Valparaiso local out of Chicago. In a small way, they have commuter service in Pittsburgh, but mainly we're talking New York and Philadelphia, right? In New York, some of it is operated by Pennsylvania Railroad proper, so basically anything going south out of Penn Station into New Jersey is either Pennsylvania Railroad or is operated by the New York and Long Branch as a cooperative thing with Reading. But mostly it's the Long Island Railroad from Penn Station onto Long Island. And then in Philadelphia, it is the Pennsylvania Railroad proper. So let's look at each of those in turn. We'll start with, I mean, these things happening more or less at the same time. Um, Start with Philadelphia. Philadelphia today has a horrifically inadequate subway system, but a pretty robust commuter rail system, thanks to the
Hmm.
lines built by the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading. Um, people are taking to their cars and so forth, even in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, World War II is a great impetus in commuter service, as it is in long distance passenger service, because gasoline is rationed, tires, rubber is rationed. There are all kind of restrictions on driving cars. Um, and so people flock to the commuter trains, not because they want to, because they have to. And conditions are pretty primitive, right? The Pennsylvania area is putting anything and everything. They convert box cars. I mean, they do put windows in them. I'll give them that. But there are people riding to and from work in box cars with windows, but still, it's not optimal. And there are complaints, as you might say, about that. And after World War II, commuters make it clear that, they're done with the Pennsylvania Railroad, right? They're going to take to their cars and so forth if they can, but the railroad is still legally required to operate commuter service. Um, in part because it's one of the mechanisms Pennsylvania Railroad employees use to get to and from their jobs on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Um, so the problem is really the equipment and the frequency of service. I mean, commuter service is problematic because it's got like a bimodal distribution, right? Inbound to Center City in the morning, outbound in the evening, but not much during the rest of the day or on weekends. So it's a pretty lousy way to make use of train crews and equipment, which, sit idle for a good portion of the day. Um, at the same time, the equipment that dates back, I mean, in the 1950s, there are people commuting to work on the same MP-57 cars that took doughboys home after the armistice in 1918. This stuff is worn out. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad wants new stuff, new equipment. But, why invest money? I mean, the company has very little money anyway in money losing commuter service, right? They acquire some were called Pioneer 3 cars, which is a product of the Budd Manufacturing Company, right? The same company that built the Zephyr, which are also based in Philadelphia, right?
Hmm.
And so Budd has built, along with Pullman Standard, has built a lot of equipment for long distance passenger trains, right? But by the mid 1950s, that market is essentially gone. And Bud is desperate for new business. So they developed this thing called the Pioneer 3. The Zephyr, by the way, was the Pioneer 2 and so forth. Um, the Pioneer 3 was originally intended as a low-cost, sort of intermediate distance passenger car, like for trips of 400 or 500 miles. They were pretty Spartan, pretty basic, right? Um, and the railroads didn't show much interest in that. And so Bud kind of approached the Pennsylvania Railroad and said, how about we kind of modify these, put some, you know, um, collectors on them to collect power from the pantographs, to collect power from the catenary, and we make them into electrified commuter coaches, right? To replace these MP-54s. And, that worked okay, but again, the cost. And so, Sims says, love them, but can't afford them. Maybe we can get somebody else to pay for them. Okay. At the same time, right, this is happening coincidentally with changes in the Philadelphia city government, which had been historically dominated by the Republican political machine, which was, to a large degree allied, at least in the early 20th century, with the Pennsylvania Railroad. But there have been a lot of corruption and so on, investigations and everything. Um, and as a result, there is a kind of profound sort of transformation in Philadelphia civic politics. And the Republicans are out, the Democrats are in, and have remained in the mayor's office ever since. In particular, Richardson Dilworth, right, who eventually becomes mayor of Philadelphia. Um, and Dilworth and others are legitimate. Well, they want votes, obviously, but they're also legitimately concerned about improving the quality of life in Philadelphia. So they support a massive bond issue to build new water and sewer systems to try to extend the subway line, but also to support commuter rail, right? Um, so they come up with this municipal corporation called PSIC, the Passenger Service Improvement Corporation, um, that gets around certain legal restrictions in the Philadelphia City Charter. And what they arrange to do is to well, they don't call it a subsidy, right? Subsidy is a dirty word. They call it buying service. They say, we're not giving money, we're not giving government money to a private corporation. What we're doing is buying service, kind of the same way you might go to a station and buy a railroad ticket, except on a bigger scale. So, what they agreed to do with the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading was to pay for certain improvements at stations like park and ride lots and so forth, um, to buy new equipment and to purchase a certain amount of service, right? Which is a subsidy. They just didn't call it that. Now, the problem is when this new equipment comes online, they're called Silverliners. The Silverliner cars are very nice. There are not that many of them, but they are owned not by the Pennsylvania Railroad or by the Reading. They're owned by PSIC and therefore by the city of Philadelphia. And what that means is legally they cannot leave the city and county of Philadelphia, which are contiguous. That's awkward because all the commuter routes actually go well outside the county. Um, so there's a limit to the value of this. So for Dilworth and other municipal officials, the next logical step is to get the other suburban counties on board. And they're reluctant for any number of reasons. For one thing, this is not long after Brown v. Board has desegregated education. And there's a lot of white flight to the suburbs, right? To get away from the possibility that white children are going to be enrolled in school districts with African Americans. So suburban communities are very anxious to maintain their political autonomy. They tend to be very Republican when the city of Philadelphia is strongly Democratic. And they also don't want to cough up any money to support commuter services if they can possibly avoid it.
Hmm.
Now, this coincides with the election of John F. Kennedy to the presidency, and then, of course, after his assassination, Lyndon Johnson. Now, Kennedy and especially Johnson pursue an aggressive civil rights agenda, which alienates Southern Democrats. And Johnson, in particular, is no fool. He sees what's happening. He says, like Kennedy before him, he says we need to bolster the support base of the Democratic Party by getting votes from the Northeast, from American cities, to counteract the loss of political support from Southern Democrats. Um, and so, as a result, Kennedy and Johnson both begin to pour federal resources. I say pour, it's actually fairly modest. They begin to direct federal resources into urban communities. Initially, they perceive of commuter rail not as a transportation issue, but as a housing issue through the HHFA, the Housing and Home Finance Administration. And that becomes the mechanism to support urban redevelopment, which includes support for commuter rail. So it's a complicated process, but the point is this. Um, Philadelphia, the city and county of Philadelphia, the city government is behind an effort to create CPACT, which is a multi-county kind of administrative oversight body. And the purpose of CPACT is to channel federal funds into support for commuter rail operations. It's a matching grant system. And so the federal government puts in the bulk of the money, and individual counties are on the hook for a relatively small amount. And once they join CPACT, the counties are eligible to participate in these various, they're called operations, like Operation Northeast, Operation Northwest, Operation Paoli, Operation Bryn Mawr, Operation whatever. They go through various iterations, which means that they now have access to not subsidized, but purchased service and access to what is still a very small number of Silverliner cars, except for Delaware County. They want nothing to do with this, which is a problem because Delaware County sits right astride the main line between Center City, Philadelphia, and Paoli. And if Delaware County is not involved, then this Silverliner equipment cannot get any farther west than Bryn Mawr, which again is a problem. And the reason that Delaware County doesn't want to be involved is the usual stuff. They're, Republican, conservative, suburban, the budget issues, but also Delaware County is home to the Red Arrow, what later becomes, the high speed Patco high speed line, managed by the Merritt family. And Merritt says, wait a minute, let me get this straight. I'm running a private transit operation here, and the government is subsidizing my competition? Are you kidding me? We're not going to do this. And Dilworth and other municipal officials who support commuter rail are putting forth all kind of figures that say, what we're doing here is taking people out of their cars and off the highway. You have to understand that at this time, the final extension of the Schuylkill Expressway is being built in the center city of Philadelphia. And the Schuylkill is dumping commuters in their cars onto the streets of Philadelphia, and the streets of Philadelphia are not equipped to handle it. Philadelphia has very narrow streets, has since the colonial period. And it's creating what the Philadelphia Inquirer called a monumental snafu and a grand slam traffic jam. And so, as happened in many other cities, including my hometown of Atlanta, the freeway network quickly becomes inadequate to support the amount of traffic on it. And so the city government is faced with two choices. Either acquiesce to the extraordinary cost and dislocation associated with building new freeways, right? Nobody wants to have a freeway bulldoze their neighborhood, or find some way of unclogging the Schuylkill Expressway and basically the highway network. And so Dilworth and other municipal officials say, what our purchasing of service is doing is to get people out of their cars. They have survey data to prove it, right? They distribute surveys in these various operation train runs, these commuter runs. And sure enough, commuters are saying, oh, yes, I used to drive to work, but now I take the Paoli local because I like the service better now. It's more frequent. We have new equipment and so forth. And so that's why I did it. But even within PSIC, right, some of the number crunchers in PIC are holding up their hand and saying, wait a minute, be careful about what this survey data says. Because what's happening is that many people don't have cars and they're embarrassed to admit that they can't afford an automobile. So they're pretending that they left their car at home in the garage in order to take commuter rail. But what they're actually doing is simply, they're not mode switching from car to rail. They're switching from the red arrow lines to the commuter rail lines. And they acknowledge that Merritt has a point when he says that government subsidies are poaching my traffic and I won't stand for it. And so Merritt is behind the unwillingness of the Delaware County commissioners to support the extension of, again, not subsidized, but that's what it is, commuter rail through Delaware County. And that delays the process. Eventually, the end run around that is created yet another agency called SEPTA, which brings the state government involved and creates the basis of the system we have today. But understand when finally Delaware County gives in and this commuter rail service with the new equipment is extended all the way to Paoli and to many other places. Um, what happens is the bulk of the money is provided by the federal government. Some of it's provided by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The tracks and the station and the platforms are owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Silverliner cars are owned by the Public Service Improvement Corporation, aka the City of Philadelphia, which is the city's contribution to the money pool that is managed by CPAC, and CPAC is responsible for coordinating the counties in the kind of metro Philadelphia area under the stewardship of a state agency known as SEPTA. In other words, it gets really complicated really fast. Uh, but it still exists. And that commuter rail traffic that used to serve Pittsburgh, that's all gone. There was nothing equivalent to PSIC, no effort in Pittsburgh to save commuter rail. It has disappeared, and highway congestion as a result. Now, shifting to New York, it's a parallel story, a little bit different in the sense that it's the Long Island Railroad, which is owned entirely as a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Um, the two companies share access to Penn Station, um, still do, although it's Amtrak now. Um, and that's part of the problem because when Alexander Cassatt envisioned Penn Station, he saw it as a grand monumental gateway to New York. He didn't think in terms of lowly commuters. He thought of, trains like the Broadway Limited pulling in and all these fine folk, the elites going through the grand concourse. And so the facilities for commuters in Penn Station were never adequate. Penn Station has, and it still is, being almost continuously rebuilt to handle commuter traffic. Um, the issue here, though, is this, that because it's a joint facility, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Long Island Railroad each pay a share of the operating costs and the debt service on the facility. Now, in one sense, it doesn't matter because they're what? The same company. It's just an accounting gimmick. However, commuters become convinced that the Long Island Railroad is subsidizing the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is laughably absurd because it actually happens the other way. The Pennsylvania Railroad massively subsidizes the Long Island Railroad. Um, but that's not what commuters think, particularly when the Long Island Railroad asks for a fare increase. Commuters say, yeah, all you're doing is sending money to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad is milking the Long Island, and that word milking comes up a lot. It's an odd metaphor. I don't know how many cows there were on Long Island, at least not in the areas served by the Long Island Railroad in the 1920s. Not many, I assume, but they were talking about milking the Long Island Railroad for everything it's worth. And so there's resistance and resistance and resistance to a fare increase. Mayor Hyland gets involved. He's a populist mayor who launches his own invective against the Long Island Railroad and the PRR. They become convenient scapegoats. He tries every political trick in the book. Um, George Laboutier, who's the Long Island Railroad's manager and a former PRR executive, he has a run-in with Hyland. Hyland deliberately mispronounces his name, calls him an outsider from Chicago, who wasn't from Chicago, he's from Pittsburgh, doesn't matter. But Hyland has his own agenda, including promoting the independent subway network, the city-owned subway network, which is, again, going to poach traffic from the Long Island Railroad. And so for decades, the Long Island Railroad doesn't get a fare increase. The situation goes into World War II, and again, there's the same issue of high ridership, but wear and tear on the equipment and the physical plant. After World War II, um, the Long Island Railroad is hemorrhaging money. again, the accusations that the Pennsylvania Railroad is milking Long Island Railroad for all it's worth. There's of course subsidized highway competition. You can thank, of course, Robert Moses and his plan to blacktop a good portion of greater New York. Um, but also the same realization that the highway network is getting clogged. And maybe there's a role for government in supporting commuter rail as an alternative to clogged highways and enormous investments in the road network. But there's a problem, even more so in New York than in Philadelphia. This is what? This is the 50s. This is the Cold War. This is McCarthyism. And so anytime anybody says government should take over the operations of the Long Island Railroad, people scream communist menace. This is the first step toward the, you know, nationalization of the railroad network. And that becomes a non-starter. And so the question then becomes, how does the government assist the Long Island Railroad without being, without seeming to assist the Long Island Railroad? So there are more battles over fare increases. It's complicated by the fact that nobody can quite determine whether or not the Long Island Railroad is an interstate or intrastate company. Technically, it's intrastate because its tracks only serve New York. But it also is a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is clearly an interstate company. And even though its passenger traffic is local, the Long Island Railroad also has freight business, which does, those freight cars do go into the larger railroad network. Um, Again, it's interstate. So there's huge jurisdictional battles between the state of New York, the city of New York, right, which controls Brooklyn and Manhattan. I'm sorry, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, and then the state of New York, which controls the outlying suburban counties, the federal government through the ICC. I mean, it's a jurisdictional mess. Um, Retards a fare increase. Finally, the Long Island Railroad is able to get a fare increase, and then the next day it declares bankruptcy, which is engineered by the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had to be done, but of course the timing stinks. And commuters in Long Island are screaming about this. And the uh, credibility gap is pretty high here, right, between the PRR, Long Island Railroad, and commuters in New York, well, and the government too. And then there are the accidents. There are a whole series of accidents, including some catastrophic wrecks that killed dozens of people. Um, and those wrecks are the catalyst for change. In fact, the deputy mayor of New York, in the aftermath of one of these wrecks, which occurs like on the evening, the day before Thanksgiving. So, I mean, that's the headlines on Thanksgiving Day, is the war in Korea and a catastrophic wreck with people still being, alive and dead, cut out of the tattered remnants of these commuter cars. The deputy mayor of New York says something must be done to stop the carnage. If government ownership is the answer, that's it. So now a public figure is saying we need to seriously consider having the government take over because private enterprise has screwed up royal. And so the story goes on and on and on to the bankruptcy of the Long Island Railroad, attempts to solicit funds, especially at the federal level, what those funds can be used for. Can they be used to support a bankrupt company? Should they be used to improve service in general? Should they be used to promote safety? And eventually it kind of collides headlong with Governor Nelson Rockefeller's agenda, which includes building the World Trade Center, um, which originally was going to be on the east side of Manhattan, and therefore served much more so than the current site is today by the Long Island Railroad. It shifts then to the site where it was prior to 9/11. That, of course, involves what was originally known as the Hudson and Manhattan Railway, right? Which is also bankrupt. And so the point is that if the Hudson and Manhattan goes down, if it fails, not only are the states of New York and New Jersey going to have to invest in the highway network, but commuters are not going to be able to get to the site of the World Trade Center. And so there's a bi-state compact between New York and New Jersey that eventually involves rescuing the Hudson and Manhattan, making it entire, part of Port Authority Trans-Hudson and so forth. But that sets the pattern for not merely subsidies, but eventually a governmental takeover of the commuter rail operations of the Long Island Railroad and other carriers in greater New York, um, under a promise to improve service. And it takes a while, and many people on Long Island are still complaining about the quality of service and the fares and so forth. But again, it's a very complicated story that's made more complicated by the relationship between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Long Island Railroad, and by the Cold War context in which people cannot really come to terms with the idea that private sector companies are no longer able to operate a service for the public good when that service is no longer profitable.
I appreciate that discussion, especially with the history of the political economy behind the creation of SEPTA for our Philadelphia-based listeners. I don't know how much you follow the news in this area, but SEPTA is headed toward a budgetary cliff going into the rest of this year and into next. And while the specifics of the issues have changed, it's interesting to see how similar they look now as they did to mid-century.
Yes, I think we're revisiting, especially under the, current and very recent transformations in the federal budgeting process, a kind of another iteration of the very complex and very divisive debates that occurred in the 50s and 60s, in terms of, we all agree, or most of us agree, that these kind of commuter rail services are necessary, vital for cities in the Northeast and in other parts of the country as well. The sticky bit is who pays for them. And for many, many years, that question was kind of shunted to the back burner because the federal government simply acted as the banker of last resort, as a essentially unlimited pool of resources to fund service improvements, equipment, that kind of thing. And that is really, for a number of reasons, not no longer the case. So.
Yes, and I suspect if we ever have reason to talk about the Conrail era, we can talk more about Philadelphia commuting in particular.
Oh, I'd love to do that. And if I can offer a shameless plug that I am now working as co-author on a book about Conrail, history of Conrail. So it's in its early stages yet, but hopefully that'll be out just in a couple of years.
Yes, we're really looking forward to it. But for right now, should we talk about the Metroliner, or in the interest of time, shove ahead to the merger? Or really, in some ways, again, everything's happening all at once.
Yes. I mean, as y'all might have guessed by now, each one of these chapters could almost be a standalone book in itself. That's certainly true of the merger chapter, which is by far the longest of any of the three volumes. It is really, in some sense, a book within a book. And yes, it includes kind of right in the middle this section on the Metroliner, as well as a section on diversification, which I'll mention briefly, but only just in the interest of time. And so it's hard to kind of separate those out because they're all kind of interconnected. I'll talk about the Metroliner first because it was a kind of logical extension of support for commuter rail operations. The initial Metroliner cars are Silverliners, or were Silverliners, repurposed for high-speed operation, which right there tells you this is high speed on a low budget. And The instigating factor here, of course, was Shinkansen, the Japanese high-speed rail network that emerged in Japan for a whole bunch of reasons that were almost unique to Japan. The destruction of World War II, the desire to kind of rehabilitate Japan's reputation in the world, the desire to prove Japanese industrial prowess and know-how, the upcoming Tokyo Olympics, the unwillingness to expand the highway network and so forth. And so the development of high-speed rail in Japan came about at a unique time and under a unique set of circumstances that would not be replicable in Japan today, much less any other country in the world. It was a project that was successful, remains successful from a technological perspective, but I should point out that it came in at twice over budget. In fact, one of the principal developers of Shinkansen was so humiliated by that he committed suicide. So right there is not only an inspirational lesson, but also a cautionary lesson. Yes, we can do it, but do you have any idea how much this is going to cost? And so the Shinkansen fired the imagination of American planners, um, particularly individuals like the kind of iconoclastic Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell, um, who was a big fan of the megalopolis, right? Which we kind of think of as a pejorative term, right? As something bad. But he envisioned, he wasn't the first person to do it, but he envisioned this kind of huge metropolitan corridor stretching from, say, southern New England all the way into northern Virginia and so forth, bound together by infrastructure, energy, transportation, communication, you name it, a kind of mega city with smaller satellite cities within it. And critical to that was, of course, the rail network, and especially because Claiborne Pell loved trains. I mean, he traveled by train all the time, and he saw firsthand the degradation of rail passenger service in what is now becoming known as the Northeast Corridor. And he says we got to do something about it. And so he badgered. I mean, he really did badger first Kennedy. Well, he started with Kennedy, and that had some results to support transportation improvements in the Northeast Corridor. And this is coinciding with um, a sort of technology boom in American public policy, right? Um, there's, of course, the Apollo program, which serves as a model of what the government can do. But big caveat here, when it throws enough money at the problem, right? Um, but also that inspired people, or more than one individual, including Pell and Lyndon Johnson, when he became president, who said basically, if we can send men into orbit, why can't we move them between New York and Washington at a reasonable rate of speed? If the Japanese can do it, why can't we do it? And that's kind of technological enthusiasm spilled over into projects like the SST, right, the supersonic transport, which is under development. And in fact, the development of high-speed rail followed a very kind of similar model, right, to the development of the SST. And I guess if you say one thing about the Metroliner, it actually has done a lot better than the SST did in the great scheme of things. Um, So obviously Kennedy's assassination put a damper on things for a while. It fell to the Johnson administration. Johnson was kind of unconvinced but cautiously supportive of this as Pell and others continued to kind of push, and as the Democratic Party again is trying to draw in votes from the urban Northeast. And so there's limited government support for this. And it's critical that the Pennsylvania Railroad get involved as well, because it's their tracks between New York and Washington. Um, New Haven is also involved north to Boston, but it's mostly the PRR. And the PRR is going to have to put money into this. So the PRR has done a study about passenger service, and what they basically say is um, it's a disaster. Long distance passenger service and commuter service is a money loser. We've got to get rid of it as fast as possible, with one exception. Travel between New York and Washington remains strong. If we can find somebody to give us a small amount of money to buy new equipment and make very modest improvements to stations and so on, while putting in a modest amount of money on our own. In other words, if we can get the government to pay for some of this, we can actually improve service and make a small profit between New York and Washington. And so that agenda coincides with the federal government's agenda of high-speed rail, which does not envision modest improvements to conventional rail service. It involves sweeping changes, right? And understand that conventional rail service to New York and Washington is already routinely hitting 90 miles an hour, right? But the visionaries say 120, 150, and in fact 150 becomes the kind of default target. It's a kind of a random number, but it has a nice ring to it. Even today, Amtrak says, our Acela trains get up to 150, which they do for a few miles. But the average speed, of course, the Northeast Corridor is far, far, far lower than that. Um, in any event, these two agendas collide. And so Pennsylvania Railroad negotiators are saying, give us money for small improvements. The federal government is saying, help us change the world. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad ends up signing a contract that is basically open-ended in the sense that the amount of money that the Pennsylvania Railroad agrees to invest in this high-speed rail demonstration project is not clearly articulated. It's essentially a fill in the blank later number. Whereas the federal government's commitment is much more modest and essentially capped. One person called it the worst contract ever negotiated in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which it probably was. Um, and I'll get into later a reason why the Pennsylvania Railroad agreed to that contract. In any case, the larger problem was the supporters of high-speed rail couldn't figure out what they wanted. Um, the dream was to have some kind of radically new transportation system, maglev, monorails, pneumatic tubes, space age travel. Or, which is a kind of a pie in the sky dream, maybe 20 years down the road. Or do you want something that can be implemented fairly quickly by using the existing roadbed right of way and so forth? Which is a problem because all that stuff dates the 1930s. Well, actually, the right of way dates to the 1830s, parts of it. But the catenary, okay. So in Japan, the Shinkansen, right? The catenary is at uniform height. It varies by at most 6 inches along the whole route. Um, Northeast corridor can vary by as much as 3 feet. So right there, in Shinkansen, the wires, the catenary is under constant tension. Um, Pennsylvania Railroad catenary is not tensioned properly. It expands and contracts with the temperature and so forth. It is not it's state of the art for the 1930s, not for the 1960s, right? Um, but can you kind of layer high-speed operations in that? So it's a classic case of, I think it was Voltaire, it's attributed to Voltaire, I think. Do not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And the most dedicated supporters of high speed, I won't say rail, I'll say high speed travel, wanted the perfect, and they lost sight of the good. They lost sight of the attainable. In any case, their efforts were also um, um, scattered too widely. They had like $80 million to do this demonstration project. And it was scattered 4 ways. Number one, high-speed rail for the Northeast Corridor. Number two, some way of implementing high-speed rail, don't laugh, on the New Haven, which was a disaster. I mean, the tracks were almost unusable. Um, on the non-electrified section between New York and Boston, I'm sorry, New Haven and Boston, which is where the turbo train comes from.
Mhm.
Um, The third thing was the pie in the sky visionary, the blue sky proposals, as some people call them. And the fourth was a way of integrating auto and rail transportation, which bizarrely enough became, in terms of results per dollar invested, the most successful part of the whole high-speed rail demonstration project, um, because that became AutoTrain. That was the genesis of AutoTrain, as it later became. But back to high-speed rail. Again, this is on a low budget. So the Pennsylvania Railroad is working with Bud to do this. And they're using repurposed Silverliner cars, which are designed for commuter rail operation, never designed for high speed. And they're loading these things with instrumentation, everything to measure. They're also upgrading a section of track on what is now known as the Raceway, right? In New Jersey, it's straight, it's flat, it's a good place to do, to upgrade it to 150-mile-an-hour operation, right? Um, so this is a clear, this is a clearly an incremental learning process, right? Oh, they can't just borrow from the Japanese, right? Because there are domestic content laws here. So it's got to be an American project, right? We're not going to do what the
Hmm.
Japanese did. Um, so anybody with an ounce of common sense and representatives from the Pennsylvania Railroad and all the equipment suppliers said this. They said, it's going to take at least 5 years of testing before we even know what we're doing here, before we even know what we're dealing with. But the Johnson administration wanted results, right? They wanted headlines that say, Lyndon Johnson brings high-speed rail to the Northeast, um, before 1968, right? Which is, presidential election day. They actually wanted it before 1966, which November, right? Midterm elections. In other words, we want results fast. What that meant was that the Pennsylvania Railroad is now contracting with Bud for the production of the actual vehicles that will run along the Northeast Corridor before they've even begun testing the prototypes. And again, any engineer will say that's stupid, but that's what they did because the clock was ticking. The biggest problem with that is that, of course, they had to have electrical equipment, right? Because these are electrified multiple unit trains. And this had never been done before, at least not in the American context. Um, and so the decision fell actually to David Smucker, who acquires later on a rather unsavory reputation in the Penn Central era. Um, David Smucker, he's got a lot of advice about this, but it's ultimately his call. He's faced with two sets of proposals, one from Westinghouse, the other from GE. Um, and it's essentially a coin flip for him. And he says, quite literally, he says, I wasn't sure which one was better, but I figured I'd rather take the chance of being 50% wrong and 50% right than making the wrong choice and being 100% wrong. So he said, well, half the equipment on the Metroliners, half the Metroliner cars, we use GE electrical equipment, half we use Westinghouse, under the assumption that one of them's got to work. Well, actually, neither one of them worked effectively. But these are now incompatible equipment, right? Operated by two companies or developed by two companies that literally could not communicate technical information to each other because of antitrust laws. So they couldn't share data. And they go off and develop their own electrical systems. The one developed by General Electric, it has teething problems, right? In fact, the whole thing has teething problems. So, while they're testing this equipment, they're bringing the actual production Metroliner cars online. The first ones come online. They're testing them, and they're uncovering bug after bug after bug after bug. I mean, Robert Watson, who is still with us,
Hmm.
he was who was in charge of the testing process, and whose papers that cover all of this are at the Hagley. They're an extraordinary resource for anybody studying the Metroliner project. Um, it was exasperating. I mean, there's report after report saying this went wrong, that went wrong, and so they're debugging all of this. But at least the GE stuff could be debugged. The Westinghouse equipment was much more systemic. It was basically unusable. And so they're delay after delay after delay. I mean, it's a very long story, but it didn't help either that there was so much hype, so much PR over what we're going to accomplish with high-speed rail that the actual results were not only mediocre and disappointing, but people felt like they'd been victimized by a bait and switch. And so, the initial Metroliner cars are delivered with the Pennsylvania Railroad Keystone on the front. Metroliner service, revenue service never happens under the PRR. It's Penn Central that does that, and so forth. Um, the good thing, the two good things I'll say about Metroliner, the project kept the idea of high-speed rail in the public consciousness for years. And I think that contributed ultimately to the formation of Amtrak, the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project, the introduction of Acellas, all of the good things that have happened in the corridor since then. Um, it also, even though the Metroliner was a technological fiasco, it was a marketing success. And, from the beginning, um, the Department of, first was the Department of Commerce, then the Department of Transportation, and the PRR, they were determined to make the Metroliner glamorous, right? Kind of like air travel. And so, they paid a lot of attention to interior amenities. They had a phone system on board. They had car attendants. They were called Metro Misses, which, who dressed up in classic 1970s mini skirts and all of that. And, this is flash, it's glitz, it's glamour, it's window dressing. But again, I think it was a marketing success and one that made people think about rail travel as something other than decrepit, dirty, malfunctioning passenger equipment creaking along, rusty rails at 30 miles an hour. But it also had a lot to do with the merger. So we maybe want to finish up with that.
Yes, though if I might do a shameless plug of my own regarding Mr. Watson, there will be a series of oral history interviews with him coming to Hagley's digital archive later this year that I hope will also be just as useful for future researchers as his tremendous collection of papers at Hagley is.
Oh, that's fabulous. And it's as a historian, I resist attributing anything to any one individual, but I think I'm on pretty firm ground when I say that if it had not been for Bob Watson, Metroliner never would have happened. Who knows how it would have played out, but I mean, the results that it achieved, as mediocre as they were, would not have been possible without his involvement in that project and his dedication to it. So.
Yes, and I think that's a very fair assessment as I've observed interviewing not just Mr. Watson, but anybody who really worked for the railroads during this period of bankruptcy, mergers, uncertainty in the Northeast. Uh, One continually emerging pattern is that these are all tremendously mission-driven people.
Absolutely. And, certainly when we talk about the Penn Central merger, there were any number of managerial screw ups at the C-suite level, right? The head office. But throughout that process, mid-level managers and employees, let's be clear about that too. Employees and managers remain dedicated, passionate about, and dedicated to their jobs. And that's what saved the industry, right? I mean, yes, Conrail, government bailout, all this, but it was the dedication of those individuals. Some of them quite rightly famous, others unfortunately largely forgotten, who have, preserved the industry and carried us through to the kind of era of deregulation and uh, prosperity and success we see today.
We'll be talking about them in full and this time in a year or two, maybe,
I
hopefully.
hope so. Yes.
But concluding with the merger for now.
Okay, that's a day-long interview in itself. Did you have any specific questions on that, or you want me to just sort of give you the edited version?
Yeah, I found our general approach so far, this conversation of doing the edited version has worked out very well, but I suppose that the 2 day long version of a specific question is why.
Why the merger happened? Can I give you two reasons?
Sure.
The entire Northeastern railroad industry was screwed up royal in a systemic way, and personalities matter.
Hmm.
And that's often, isn't that the kind of conundrum in history? Is like, are people the kind of creators of change or the maybe not victims of, but are the products of change? And the answer is both, obviously. Let's get to the systemic level. I mean, by the mid 50s, the Northeastern railroads were in trouble. You know, it's a cyclical industry, but they had never really recovered. Certainly the PRR hadn't, from the wear and tear of the war. You know, there are capital shortages. They were earning. I mean, we're talking about less than 1% rate of return on capital investment. And as anybody in Wall Street will tell you, that's like, bad. That's like, death sentence bad. Um, but they sort of, each time there'd be a burst of prosperity, they kind of muddle through and so forth. Um, and then the Eisenhower recession hit. It's called that. I don't blame him for it, right? But it happened on his watch. And the Eisenhower recession was a little bit different. It wasn't from the perspective of most Americans that severe, but it was really it hit hard the kind of big manufacturing sector industries, which are the kind of industries that generate a lot of traffic through railroads. So the downturns and well, coal traffic is going down anyway, right? Because coal prices are increasing and so forth. Shift to oil, natural gas. The steel industry is in trouble already, right? Even by the mid 50s, the American steel industry is seriously in trouble. So, you're talking about major sectors of the economy, coal, steel, and so forth that really affect the Pennsylvania Railroad's traffic base. And the Eisenhower recession really puts the kind of cap on it. And the railroads never recover from that, right? They never bounce back. That's when the death spiral really begins. Well, they do recover after staggers, but it's a very different kind of industry. Um, in the mid 50s, so personality number one is Robert R. Young, right? Who's that charismatic, outgoing um, individual who is responsible for the brief experiment in transcontinental passenger service. He goes on. He's takes over the C&O. He gains control of Chesapeake and Ohio. But what he wants is the New York Central. Um, to him, that is the gilt edge, champagne and caviar railroad of all railroads, right? That's the prestige railroad. Um, and he goes after New York Central, in part by suggesting that the current management of the New York Central is incompetent, right? William White, anyway, the president of New York Central, must be incompetent. Well, that was not true. White was really doing a lot to kind of stabilize New York Central and turn it toward prosperity. But Robert R. Young was a totally incompetent railroader. He was at best lackluster financier, but boy, could he do public relations. He was always ready with a good quotation, a nice story. He had great initials, right? R.R. Young, like railroad, and reporters thought that was kind of cool. And he waged a very public battle for control of the New York Central, and he won. And he installed Al Pearlman as president of the New York Central. Pearlman is another strong personality, right? For one thing, he is one of the few Jews in the upper ranks of management of any railroad. For another thing, he's a Westerner, right? He was on the Denver and Rio Grande Western, where he did a really good job. But the Rio Grande is a very different company than the New York Central. Now, Pearlman is a very skilled operating employee, right? I mean, there's no question about that. Um, and he was certainly qualified to take over the New York Central. Um, but there's a very brief moment when Robert Young and Al Pearlman are basically celebrating the fact that they've gained control of the New York Central. They've done it, they won, they're in charge. Then they look at the books. They look at the company's finances, and they are practically panic stricken. They had no idea the company was in that bad of a shape. It was months from bankruptcy. They are absolutely aghast. And I mean, again, this is not what we have to do to improve things. This is, we're not sure this is salvageable. Um, that's when Young approaches Sims and he says, why don't we merge these railroads together? That will be the salvation. Sims has his doubts, but he eventually becomes, I won't say enthusiastic, but he eventually becomes committed to this. But it's up to him really to win over his counterpart at the New York Central, Al Pearlman. And Pearlman does have doubts. Pearlman is not happy about this at all, in part because he thinks he might actually be able to save the New York Central on his own, in part because he realizes that if there is a merger, it's not going to be a merger of equals. The Pennsylvania Railroad is almost certainly going to just sort of gobble up the New York Central. And in part because he has suspicions, justifiable suspicions, that the sort of Pennsylvania mainline Protestant country club management of the Pennsylvania Railroad is pretty openly anti-Semitic. And there are, in fact, some correspondence that indicates that Pennsylvania Railroad executives, I won't say which ones, were viciously anti-Semitic. Um, and these talks go forward, but in a kind of desultory, off again, on again way. And then as the economy worsens, as the New York Central is going to have to pass on its annual dividend, there is a directors meeting in Palm Beach, Florida, which Robert Young attends. He's despondent, um, almost uncommunicative. He locks himself in the billiard room of his mansion in Palm Beach with a shotgun, and that's the end of that. And in the aftermath of Young's suicide, the merger negotiations fall apart. Um, and in the aftermath, it's one of those he said things. Each side blames the other, with the kind of parting shot being put forth by Al Pearlman, who basically says, why marry the Penn Central? Why court the girl when there might be another heiress to come and sit in your lap? So Pearlman at least publicly says, we don't need the Pennsylvania Railroad. We're fine. And for a while, the economy kind of ticks up a little bit and the companies start to make money. But then it all plunges down again. Um, and Sims then tries to restart the merger negotiations. And this time, Pearlman is more receptive because, again, his company is in trouble. And they establish committees, each company does, which are in many cases kind of uncommunicative with each other. Um, they spend a great deal of time and effort determining the exchange ratio. That is, how many shares of Pennsylvania Railroad stock versus New York Central stock are traded in for each share of what becomes eventually Penn Central stock. What they don't ever do is come up with a framework for integrating the operations of the two companies. That's a tomorrow problem. Um, at the same time, Sims becomes aware that he's not the right person to lead the Pennsylvania Railroad into um, this new era of merger negotiations. Now, at this time, Sims is no longer president. He's board chairman, right? He has stepped down from the presidency and he has turned things over to the last president, as it turns out, of Pennsylvania Railroad, Alan Greeno, in a rather odd way, right? Um, he invites Greeno into his office and says, "Hi, Alan, how you doing?" Okay. How's things going? Doing okay. Congratulations, Alan. What did I do? Right? Because when you hear that, you think it's being like sarcastic, right? I
Hmm.
must be in trouble. And Sim said, "Well, you're president of the company now." Oh, okay, great. Thank you. And Sims knows that the person he wanted, right? Um, who is Jim Newell, the vice president of operations, has become so toxic that he cannot function as president, right? The feud between him and Fred Carpy in traffic, and also now involving David Bevan. And David Bevan, it's not clear what his game is. He's got perhaps aspirations to the presidency, although it's unlikely, right? Although not unprecedented, because he's a finance guy, not an operations guy. He's playing the long game here. Um, and so he's in the mix too. And basically the entire upper management of the Pennsylvania Railroad has become almost dysfunctional. So Sims steps away from this as chairman of the board to take charge of merger planning, but he's getting older. He needs a younger guy, and in particular, a younger guy with impeccable connections to the Democratic administrations of first JFK and then especially Lyndon Johnson. And he finds one in Stuart Saunders, who's the president of the Norfolk and Western, which of course is closely affiliated with the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Saunders is not an operating guy either. He's a lawyer, right? He comes to power because he has waged a similar battle at N&W that Sims did at Pennsylvania Railroad, banishing steam locomotives from the Norfolk and Western. Um, he gains power, and his principal claim to fame is that Saunders orchestrates in 1959 a merger between the Norfolk and Western and a parallel railroad, the Virginian. And it is one of the first and arguably one of the most successful railroad mergers in American history. Um, and Saunders sets a pattern for what happens later in a number of ways. It's a parallel merger. He calls in a lot of political favors to make it happen. He buys off organized labor with promises of job guarantees and everything, which he can afford to do because the Virginian and the Norfolk and Western are each profitable coal hauling railroads. They're basically gushing money, which will not be the case with the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central. And so it all works. And everybody congratulates Saunders. You're the man of the hour, the railroader of the decade. I think it kind of goes to his head. It feeds his sort of megalomania. Um, and I think personally, he wants to do this better. He wants to create the best railroad merger in American history, the ultimate merger, the perfect merger. And that's going to be the merger of the two leading railroads in the Northeast, which will not only save the two companies, but save the American railroad industry. I really think he believed that that was his destiny. Um, the other thing we should keep in mind is that the merger of the Norfolk and Western and the Virginian foreclosed any number of other possibilities because at that time there were only three profitable coal hauling railroads in the United States: Chesapeake and Ohio, Norfolk and Western, and Virginian, which logically said that each of those three railroads could be the kind of cash cow for a much less profitable northeastern system that is a three system east. Once Saunders merged the Norfolk and Western with the Virginian, that possibility was realistically gone forever. There were now only two profitable Pocahontas coal hauling railroads: the bigger N&W, the Chesapeake and Ohio. That precluded anything but a two system east. And from a very early date, planners in the Department of Commerce, the transportation subsection, they spotted this. They said right away, there are an almost infinite number of permutations here, but in the end, the only way this is going to come down to it is a two system east. One northeastern system allied with the Norfolk and Western, logically the Pennsylvania Railroad. Another northeastern system, logically the New York Central, allied with the Chesapeake and Ohio, and then everything else gets kind of pasted in around the edges. And if you think about it, when Conrail broke up, that's exactly what happened, right?
Hmm.
Although it just took like, 30 plus years to get there, and a lot of pain and misery in the process. So Saunders then leaves the N&W and comes to Philadelphia as the new chairman of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And his only real job is to grease the skids for the merger with the New York Central. And so everything focuses around that. And again, there is nothing to do with post-merger operational planning. That's a tomorrow problem, right? It's he pushed down the road. While all this is going on, I should point out very quickly, and that is David Bevan is pushing a diversification agenda, right? This is where you mentioned the Six Flags over Texas, any number of, real estate properties, pipelines, and so forth. Um, and most infamously, executive jet aviation, right? I won't go into the details of all of that, except to talk about his rationale. Bevan said, look, because the railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, is so unprofitable, because the return on investment is so low, and because of the way, critically, federal corporate income taxes are structured, whatever money we have is going to earn a far higher rate of return if invested in non-rail subsidiaries than if we invested in the railroad. What that's going to do, in tandem with the steady and predictable stream of dividends that we receive from the Norfolk and Western investments, is going to keep the Pennsylvania Railroad afloat just long enough for us to abandon unprofitable lines, long enough for us to ditch our passenger service, long enough to shed excess employees, and then hopefully we can turn things around. We just have to keep bailing a little while longer, and diversification is going to be the bucket we use to bail with. And Saunders was pretty supportive of that. I mean, not officially, but behind the scenes. The railroad's operating employees were not, because again, as service continued to deteriorate, they excused their own failures by saying, give us more money. Don't give it to Bevan. Why diversify? Give us money and we'll put it in the physical plant and that'll fix everything. And Bevan knew better. So, here again, these disputes are tearing the company apart. And even though some things like executive jet aviation were dismal failures, clearly, and public relations disasters, a lot of his diversification actually worked out. So anyway, but we'll put Bevan aside for a moment and get back to Stuart Saunders, who is relentlessly lobbying the Johnson administration for approval of the merger. Um, and there are numerous proposals, backroom deals, and so forth to uh, allocate, and Saunders rather is involved in all of them, to allocate the various railroads in the Northeast to create what he envisions as a three-system East, right? Which is unrealistic, but that's what he envisions. Um, and to make this happen, he has got to win over the Interstate Commerce Commission, which he does in large part because the Interstate Commerce Commission kind of throws up its hands in despair. It says, uh, uh, we don't know what to do. They utterly fail to adopt any kind of systematic plan for the American Railroad Network. Because particularly after the Norfolk and Western Virginia merger, it opens the floodgates on various merger applications, right? Not just Penn Central, but numerous others as well. Um, and like Norfolk and Western Wabash and so forth. And the ICC, CNO, B&O is the other big one. And the ICC tries to evaluate each of them in turn, even though they clearly each affect the other. and the ICC is not willing or able to articulate a definite kind of merger policy or transportation policy. And so in the vacuum that's the ICC's inaction, the Justice Department jumps in and they say Penn Central is a huge antitrust problem for us, right? Um, and in fact, the Kennedy and to a lesser extent the Johnson administrations are pursuing an antitrust agenda. Um, to get around that, um, Saunders approaches Robert Kennedy, um, who at that time is U.S. Attorney General, and they pick an excellent moment to approach Robert Kennedy because he is within days. Actually, it's the day before he resigns as Attorney General to run as for the U.S. Senate representing New York, which is an uphill battle because Kennedy is obviously from Massachusetts. He's kind of people call him a carpetbagger in New York for running, but he wants to win Senate seat in New York and join his brother Ed, who is in the Senate in Massachusetts. So what he wants to do is get support from New York voters. And the way he wants to get that is by addressing a problem that has bedeviled New York voters for a number of years. That is, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford is about to go down completely. It is bankrupt, and it's about to collapse completely, which means loss of jobs, loss of freight service, loss of commuter service, and the potential of massive governmental subsidies. And so Robert Kennedy works out a deal with Saunders, and he says, look, here's what we'll do. You promise to take on the New Haven and make it part of the Penn Central merger or do something to save it. And in return, I will sign a memo in which I say if the Interstate Commerce Commission concurs with the Penn Central merger application, my successors in the Justice Department will not oppose it. And Saunders says deal. He makes that deal. One of many deals he makes, kind of giving away the store to get what he wants. The other deal he makes, by the way, is called the Luna-Saunders Agreement, in which he makes an agreement with the railway labor unions, basically saying you can all keep your jobs once the merger happens. Though there's a critical problem here, and that is that people's job rights accrue from when the agreement is signed, not from the merger has happened. So in the years that it takes to actually bring the merger into being, all the people who were laid off still have the right to go back and earn a Penn Central paycheck, which was phenomenally expensive. So back to the Robert Kennedy memo. The ICC subsequently does greenlight the merger, but the Justice Department continues to oppose it. So that's when Saunders gets Lyndon Johnson involved. And not directly, but indirectly through his aides, he contacts Johnson and says, I've got a piece of paper here with Robert Kennedy's signature on it that says the Justice Department should not oppose this merger, yet they still are. And so Johnson's aides, Joseph Califano mainly, bring this to the president's attention. He's out at the ranch the day before Thanksgiving. And they bring the matter to Johnson's attention, and Johnson is furious. The Miller Center has the tapes of this conversation. It's fascinating. I mean, it's quintessential Johnson. Vulgar, using swear words, disparaging the Justice Department. And Johnson is not happy about this. He basically says, look, a deal's a deal. Robert Kennedy agreed the Justice Department would not oppose the Penn Central merger. And now his successors to the Justice Department are going back on their word. And that's not quite cricket, he said. And he says, we got to stop this. And people in Justice Department say, well, but we've already got a brief before the United States Supreme Court. And Thurgood Marshall, right, who at that point is Solicitor General, is presenting a brief in front of the United States Supreme Court on behalf of the United States Justice Department opposing the Penn Central merger, and we can't just walk that back for no apparent reason. And Johnson says, I'll deal with it. So he gets on the phone again, and he calls Abe Fortas, his good friend Abe Fortas. And that conversation does not survive. Johnson ordered the tape of that conversation to be destroyed. And Abe Fortas says, well, Mr. President, here's what you do. You don't ask the Justice Department who draw the brief. You simply ask them to submit a new one saying that you're willing to concur with that the Justice Department is willing to concur with the ICC's position on this, and we no longer oppose the merger. That's Abe Fortas's advice. In this case, it's pending before the Supreme Court. Slight problem here. Abe Fortas is on the Supreme Court. He's an associate justice. So he and Lyndon Johnson, the president of the United States, worked out a deal to kneecap the Justice Department's case in the Supreme Court and to undermine the authority of Johnson's Solicitor General. That is obstruction of justice. That is an impeachable offense. That is perhaps not as bad as what happened in Watergate, but it is equally in violation of federal law. And Joseph Califano heard about this. He was appalled. He said, this is, I've never heard of anything like, I mean, Johnson kind of sails near the wind, but nothing like this. And he said, my only consolation in the matter was it's not venal. That is, Johnson was not trying to gain any personal advantage or settle any scores. He just sincerely believed in doing the right thing. And it was through that mechanism that, again, it took a while, but the Justice Department eventually backed away from opposing the merger. The Supreme Court did allow the merger to take place. This is now after years of negotiation, years of political and legal battles. Merger day is February 1st, 1968. The New Haven is brought into the Penn Central system at the end of that year, by which time it's a complete wreck. The extraordinary cost of running the New Haven, plus the labor agreement, helps to bankrupt Penn Central, as does the fact that even on merger day, there is no clear plan for operating the combined company. In fact, the only people who had definite job responsibilities on February 1st, 1968 were Saunders, Bevan, and Perlman. Nobody else in the Penn Central knew exactly what their job description was or precisely who they would report to. The story of the Penn Central bankruptcy and collapse is like a whole nother discussion. But again, that was not something that concerned Saunders. For Saunders, his goal was to create the perfect merger, not the perfect company. Creating the perfect company was somebody else's problem, not his. Yet what he had done in his attempts to manipulate the railroad industry, not just in the Northeast, but nationwide, and create three massive railroad systems in the Northeast, ended up destroying Penn Central and coming precariously close to destroying other railroads in the Northeast as well. And of course, the result of that was Conrail and again, eventually the creation of what? A two-system East, just like planners in the transportation section of the Department of Commerce had envisioned many, many decades earlier.
So what's the final takeaway?
Well, in this case, it's be careful what you wish for. But I think the final takeaway is this. As I mentioned earlier, people say, who's the villain, especially in Penn Central? Was it Bevan who screwed up? Was it Saunders who screwed up? You know, was it Perlman who screwed up? Well, yeah, they sort of all did. I mean, but there is no villain. We like to think that when there's something goes disastrously wrong, we can point to somebody and say, you screwed up. You were incompetent. You did something wrong. You know, you are the problem. The reality is, and this happens not just in the case of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but many other places in history. There are situations when everybody, you know, because nobody got up in the morning, right? Nobody got up in the morning at any time in this process and saying, I'm going to destroy the Pennsylvania Railroad once and for all. Nobody ever said that. Everybody got up in the morning and went to work and did their thing, determined to do the right thing. Everybody tried their best. Everybody did their best. And the collective result of everybody doing the right thing was a disaster. And that is a sobering, but I think important lesson that comes out of history. And so, yes, there were structural issues that didn't doom Penn Central from the get-go, but suggested that, this was never going to end well. And the whole process of merger negotiations, I said, people do matter, and certainly Sims matters. R.R. Young matters. Stuart Saunders matters. Al Pearlman matters. David Bevan matters. All those people matter. But they're also operating in a broad system of economic policy, of regulatory policy, of political arenas that sharply constrain the ability of what they can do. And until there's a paradigm shift, and it really takes the bankruptcy of Penn Central to cause that paradigm shift, to make people at all levels, whether it's labor or business or government or the news media, snap out of their complacent assumption that the railroad industry is somehow eventually going to be okay and say, actually, it's not unless we take drastic action here. It took that failure. So, I mean, the Penn Central was a successful failure in that it was the impetus that, along with a lot of other issues, led to the creation of Conrail, led to massive government intervention in the railroad industry in a way that would not have been possible in the 1950s, and then led to deregulation, the Staggers Act of 1980, and a new kind of regulatory arena that ultimately proved the salvation of the railroad industry and the creation of the industry that we have as a robust transportation operation today.
I think that's a good place to end the conversation on the book. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I think it might be interesting to end today's conversation in full then on a bit of a personal question, personal note.
Sure.
As you mentioned at the start of our talk today, writing this trilogy has been the work of a huge part of your professional life for the last couple of decades. What's it like to be done?
Um, Oddly numb, I suppose, in a certain sense. Um, I joke and it's obviously no comparison to the extraordinary amount of effort it takes to raise a human child, but I joke that my books are kind of my history of the Pennsylvania is kind of like a child, and I've since gone past the age when it could vote and drive a car, and now my books are old enough to consume alcohol, which is I guess a marker of adulthood, because it has been well over 21 years since I started this process. So yeah, it's been, so much every day, researching, writing, thinking about this, talking to people about this. But I still am. I mean, the books are written, but here I am today talking to you about them. I give other presentations, and I had sort of thought I might kind of back away from this for a little while, take a breather perhaps. But now I'm involved in this history of Conrail. And these things just happen, and I'm very fortunate. And I know that I'm sure a lot of my colleagues are jealous because they're searching around for research projects and publishers and things like that. But things just do seem to fall into my lap. People ask me to write articles and books and so on, and I have a hard time, I suppose. Maybe it's my ego saying no and saying no, I don't want to do that, because I do want to do it. It's enjoyable, it's exciting, and so there are things I often joke that I can't retire, um, because so much of what I do, I would still be doing even if I did retire. I just wouldn't be paid for it. So it's just it's a nice position to be in. There are times when I say, "Boy, I would love to not have any books to write or conference papers to write or any speeches to give," but most of the time, it's something I really enjoy doing. So, but yeah, back to your question, it's just I guess I've been a little bit too busy to really think about um, not having the Pennsylvania Railroad as the central focus of my professional life. And you can talk to my wife, who's also a historian, about this. Not really the central focus of a large part of our personal lives, our family life too, for so many years.
All right. I am very much looking forward to the Conrail book. I hope, if I might indulge in a second of promotion, I hope that there's some oral histories that will prove useful.
Absolutely, and I'll leave you to speak about the extraordinary work that you've been doing and all the remarkable people you've talked to as part of your Conrail Oral History series of interviews at the Hagley, and what a tremendous resource that is. I mean, not just for me and my co-author, who's a former Conrail executive himself, but also for anybody doing work in well, not just Conrail, but railroad history and the history of American business in general. Because that was, I mean, I think, and this is a point that we'll make when we publish our Conrail book, is how critically important Conrail was, not merely as yet another business corporation, not just yet another railroad, but as an entity that transformed not merely the railroad industry, but ushered in a kind of new paradigm, whether you want to call it neoliberal economics or something like that, that has transformed every aspect of American life in the years since Conrail was formed in 1976.
True. And there is always more to come with Hagley and railroads. We're not done yet.
Well, I'm so glad that I think a lot of people think, I almost said that railroads are so last century, but what I meant was the 19th century, that a lot of people think, oh, railroads are, been there, done that, they're gone, they've disappeared along with the horse and the buggy and so forth. They're quaint, kind of antiquarian curiosities. But as I think you and others at the Hagley know full well, railroads are not only an extraordinary part of American life today, but they continue to teach us valuable lessons about, pretty much everything that goes on in our world.
Absolutely. And I'd like to thank you again for sitting down with me today.
Well, thank you for what turned out to be just as the books tended to be much or turned out to be much longer than what I anticipated. Amazingly, I guess I should not be surprised. So did this interview, but it's been delightful to talk with you about this, and hope we can do it again soon.
Yes, and for our listeners, I hope you all enjoyed it too. Certainly hope you were able to draw some parallels between what has happened here and what still happens today in the field of railroading. And if you'd like to listen to more Hagley History Hangout, you can find us on YouTube, SoundCloud at hagley.org, hagley.org, and wherever else you get your podcasts.